She was escorted out of the hospital with her badge in someone else's hand, while the man who let a soldier die stood in the hallway and smiled. 31 years old, 8 years of trauma nursing, 4 combat deployments she never talked about, and in under 6 minutes, doctor. Perhaps Marcus Doyle had rewritten the medical record, called Security, and told everyone within earshot that Nurse Sloane Whitfield had delayed treatment on a critically wounded patient. The soldier was already gone. The lie was already typed. And Sloane was already walking toward the parking lot, hands shaking, knowing one thing with absolute certainty: she had tried to save him, and she had the proof. Before we go any further, if you're new here, subscribe to this channel right now and hit that notification bell. Because we release stories exactly like this one every week. Stories about people who were written off, blamed, and pushed out, and what happened when the truth finally caught up. Drop a like on this video and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The morning Sloane Whitfield almost saved Private Derek Holt started the same way every morning at Crestfall Regional Medical Center started with someone talking over her. It was 6:47 a.m. when she walked into the trauma bay for handoff, still pulling her hair back, still carrying the kind of tiredness that 2 cups of coffee couldn't touch. The night had been long. Even before she arrived, she'd driven 40 minutes through early fog on Route 9, listening to nothing, because silence was the only thing that didn't ask anything from her. She was 31 years old, and she had been running on that particular flavor of exhaustion for going on 2 years. Kind that doesn't come from lack of sleep, the kind that comes from fighting the same fight over and over in a place that keeps pretending the fight isn't happening. The outgoing night nurse, a quiet woman named Petra, handed her the board without making eye contact. That was normal. Eye contact between shifts meant conversation, and conversations meant staying late. Petra had 3 kids and a 40-minute commute in the opposite direction. Sloane understood. What wasn't normal was the patient in Bay 4. He was young, early 20s, military haircut, still tight at the sides even after however many hours he'd been in. An Army-issue tattoo on his left forearm, a unit designation Sloane recognized from a different life. He was conscious, but barely. His blood pressure was reading 104/68, which the night board had marked as stable, and his chart listed the admission cause as blunt force trauma from a vehicle rollover on Interstate 95 south of Carthage. Sloane looked at the chart. She looked at the patient. She looked at the chart again. Something was wrong. It wasn't one thing. It was the accumulation of small things that don't matter individually, but matter enormously together. The particular shade of pallor on his face, the way he was holding his left side without quite realizing he was doing it, the subtle distension she could see even through the gown. She had learned to read patients the way other people read weather, and this one was telling her something that the paper in her hand was not. Pulled on gloves and moved to his side. "Hey, can you hear me?" His eyes opened, dark brown, glassy with pain. "Yeah." "I'm Nurse Whitfield. I'm going to be with you this morning." "How long have you been awake?" "Didn't really sleep." His voice was low, scraped at the edges. "Hurts too much." "Where does it hurt?" "Started in my ribs." He paused, swallowed like it cost him something. "Now it's more in my stomach." Lower. "When did the stomach pain start?" "A few hours ago. Maybe around 4. Sloane noted the time. It was now 6:51. She pressed carefully below his left rib cage, gently, 2 fingers, watching his face while she did it. He flinched hard. Not a surface flinch, a deep, whole-body recoil, the kind that comes from pain that lives below the muscle layer. She noted the rigidity, the subtle asymmetric distension on the left side, color of his mucous membranes when she asked him to open his mouth. His pulse, which she counted manually against the inside of his wrist, 114 beats per minute. The chart said 94. Either his heart rate had climbed 30 beats per minute in the last few hours, or someone had written it down wrong. Both options were problems. She flagged Petra before she made it to the elevator. Who cleared him as stable? Petra turned. Dr. Doyle signed off around 4. His pulse is 114. Chart says 94. His abdomen is rigid on the left side, and he's been developing pain in his lower quadrant for the past 2 to 3 hours. I think he's bleeding internally. Petra's expression shifted not disagreement, but something more complicated than agreement. More like the look of someone who already knows how the story goes. Did you update the chart? I'm about to. Can you page Doyle before you leave? Sloane. She said it carefully. The careful way. He's in the middle of a case. Then someone needs to pull him out. Petra looked at her for a moment. Not unsympathetically. I'll send the page. She got in the elevator. Sloane went back to Bay 4. She stood at Derek Holt's bedside for the next 11 minutes, watching his monitors, updating his chart in real time, and documenting every clinical observation with the precision of someone who had learned that documentation was the closest thing to armor that a nurse could carry. Exact times, exact numbers, exact language. Nothing soft, nothing interpretive, nothing that could be dismissed as a feeling. 7:08 a.m., she flagged the chart for attending review. 7:14 a.m., she received no response. At 7:19 a.m., she went looking for Doyle herself. Dr. Marcus Doyle was 44 years old and had been chief of trauma surgery at Crestfall Regional for going on 6 years. In that time, he had developed a reputation that depended entirely on which side of the hospital you worked on. To administration, he was efficient, high volume, and profitable in the particular way that private hospital systems valued a physician who brought in referrals and moved patients through without creating liability. His numbers looked clean, his outcomes on paper were solid. He played golf with the CFO on occasional Saturdays and had the hospital director's cell number saved under a first name. To the nursing staff on his trauma floor, he was something else entirely. He had a way of walking into a room that made it immediately clear whose time mattered. He interrupted mid-sentence. He dismissed clinical observations from nurses with a particular brand of tolerance that was somehow worse than open contempt, a tired, patient, this again expression that was designed to make you feel stupid for bringing it up. He used the phrase glorified bedside monitor when he thought the right people weren't listening. He was often wrong about who was listening. In 11 months working under him, Sloane had learned one thing. The only way to get Doyle to engage with information he didn't want to hear was to present it in a format so clean and data-driven that dismissing it would require him to be visibly, documentably wrong. She had the numbers ready when she found him outside the surgical suites at 7:22 a.m. between cases moving fast. Dr. Doyle, Bay 4, Private Derek Holt. I need you to look at him. He didn't slow down. He was assessed at 4. Stable. His pressure was 104/68 at handoff. It's 98/62 now. His heart rate has climbed from a charted 94 to an observed 114. His abdomen is rigid on the left with voluntary guarding, and he's reporting progressive pain that started around 400 and has worsened significantly. His presentation is consistent with a delayed splenic hemorrhage. Doyle stopped. He turned. He looked at her the way he always looked at her, with that specific arrangement of patience that wasn't patience, you think. His vitals are trending in one direction consistently. The physical exam findings match a grade 2 or 3 splenic laceration with delayed. He was imaged. CT was done at 2 a.m. That's 5 hours ago. The initial laceration was subcapsular and contained. It could have remained stable on early imaging and ruptured gradually. That's a documented presentation. It's not rare. I've been doing trauma surgery for 17 years, he said it quietly, which was worse than when he said things loudly. Rollover with no penetrating trauma, no significant mechanism for splenic injury, and a stable initial assessment doesn't spontaneously. His mechanism was a vehicle rollover at highway speed. Left side impact. That is significant mechanism for splenic injury. It's in the admission notes. Something moved across his face. She had touched something specific, and she watched him recalibrate in real time, not because she was wrong, but because she wasn't wrong enough to dismiss cleanly. Chart your concern, he said. I'll review when I'm out of surgical. He doesn't have until you're out of surgical. That is not your determination to make. With respect, the clinical data supports an urgent. I have a patient on the table. His voice went flat. Final. The kind of flat that isn't a conclusion, but a wall. If you chart your concern, I will review it at the appropriate time. That is how this process works. That is what your role is. He pushed through the surgical suite door. The corridor was quiet behind her. A third-year resident named Tomas was standing 12 feet away, very deliberately looking at his tablet. Sloane stood there for 3 seconds. Then she went back to Bay 4 and stayed. 7:51 a.m. She paged the charge nurse, Harriet, and verbally flagged her concern about Derek Holt's deteriorating condition. Harriet came to the bedside, assessed him, agreed. The presentation was concerning, and told Sloane she would contact the attending on-call if Doyle didn't respond within 30 minutes. Sloane noted the time and kept watching. At 8:04 a.m., Derek Holt's eyes opened, and he looked at her. Really looked at her, the kind of eye contact people make when they've passed through the surface layer of pain and landed somewhere deeper. Am I going to be okay? He asked. She didn't lie. She also didn't say what she actually believed, which was that the answer depended on the next 20 minutes. I'm watching you very carefully, she said. I've been here with you all morning. I'm not going anywhere. He nodded once. His eyes closed. 8:09 a.m. His blood pressure dropped to 81/55. The rapid response was called at 8:09 a.m., the exact moment the monitor alarmed. By the time the team arrived at 8:10 a.m., Sloane had 2 large-bore IVs running, a blood draw cued for type and cross, the head of the bed positioned correctly, and the oxygen delivery system already in place. She had staged the bay the way she had staged trauma bays, in places that didn't have 30-second response times, with the focus of someone who understood that the next 60 seconds were the ones that mattered. Dr. Renata Finch, the attending on-call, arrived at 8:12 a.m. and took one look at the patient and immediately ordered emergent bedside ultrasound and surgical consult. Fast exam took 4 minutes. Free fluid in the abdomen. Probable splenic hemorrhage, expanding. Finch called it in the same breath. She was already ordering prep. Get him to surgical now. The team moved. Derek Holt was wheeled out of Bay 4 at 8:17 a.m. Doyle arrived at 8:21 a.m. He stood at the threshold of the empty bay for a moment that was almost theatrical in its stillness. The empty bed, the abandoned monitor still showing a flat baseline. The discarded packaging from the IVs Sloane had placed. He looked at Finch. What happened? Splenic hemorrhage, delayed presentation. Your nurse flagged it at handoff and documented trending vitals from 7:22. He decompensated at 8:09. Finch kept it clinical, factual. She was not interested in the politics of this moment. He's in surgical prep. You should scrub in, Doyle went. But not before he looked at Sloane. She looked back. The surgery took 2 hours and 41 minutes. Sloane spent most of it in the staff lounge, at the small corner table she always used, writing her notes with the same precision she'd started developing long before she ever worked at Crestfall Regional. She wrote the way she'd been trained to write exact times, exact clinical observations, exact language. No hedging, no softening, no phrasing that could be interpreted as uncertainty when she hadn't felt uncertain. She had flagged the patient's condition at 6:51 a.m. She had reached the attending at 7:22 a.m. She had been told to chart her concern and wait. She had charted her concern. She had also stayed at the patient's bedside for the entire interval, monitoring, updating, and escalating through the charge nurse when direct escalation produced no result. She wrote all of it, every timestamp, every name, every exact word she remembered from the conversation in the surgical corridor. Tomas came in around 9:30. He sat across from her without asking, which she appreciated. It meant he wasn't going to perform a feeling about it. "How bad was it?" he asked. "Significant hemorrhage. He'll make it if they controlled the bleed in time." He was quiet for a moment. "Doyle is talking to Harriet. I heard your name. I imagined so." He's framing it as a rapid response that was called prematurely and disrupted the coordinated surgical workflow. Sloane looked up from her notes. The rapid response was called when his pressure hit 81/55. That is the threshold. That is the protocol. The documentation of everything that preceded it is already in the chart, with timestamps going back to 6:51A. M. Tomas nodded slowly. He was looking at his hands. "I heard you tell him. In the corridor. I was right there." "I know. Are you okay?" She looked back at her notebook. "I'm finishing my notes." He left. She finished her notes. At 10:47 a.m., Derek Holt died on the surgical table. The bleed had extended further than the imaging showed. There had been a secondary vessel involvement that the rapid decompensation had complicated. They had done everything correctly once they were in. Finch was a good surgeon, steady and fast, but the window had closed somewhere in the hours between 4 a.m. and 8 a.m., while a chart marked him stable, and a physician was between cases and a nurse stood at his bedside, watching numbers move in one direction. Sloane heard the news at the nurse's station from Harriet, who said it quietly and directly, which was the right way to say it. She sat with it for a moment, just sat with it. She had known him for 3 hours and 51 minutes. She had spent most of that time fighting for him with the tools available to her. Didn't make the loss smaller. In some ways, the fighting made it heavier, because when you spend every minute of a person's last hours trying to get someone to listen, and they don't, and then the person dies, carry both the grief and the knowledge of what the grief could have been prevented by. She was still sitting there, still carrying it, when she heard Doyle's voice from the direction of the elevator. He walked out of the elevator and into the ER floor with the body language of a man who had already written the narrative and was now delivering it. His coat was straight. His expression was set. He moved to the center of the floor, not toward the nurse's station, not toward a particular person, but to the center where visibility was maximum. The ER had the particular quality of a space that had been busy and was now catching its breath. Nurses at the station. A resident reviewing charts near the medication room. Tomas near the supply wall. Harriet standing behind the main desk, watching. Doyle stopped. He looked across the floor. He pointed at Sloane. Not gestured. Pointed. Arm straight, index finger extended. The way you point at an object you want a room full of people to look at. "This," he said, at a volume that wasn't shouting but was designed to carry, is what happens when nursing staff override physician judgment and insert themselves into clinical decisions they are not qualified to make. A soldier is dead, and the disruption to this morning's coordinated trauma response contributed directly to that outcome. Sloane stood up. "I didn't override anything." Her voice was level. She had learned in places that were considerably more chaotic than this ER to keep her voice level when everything inside her was not. "I made documented clinical observations beginning at 651, and formally escalated my concern to the attending physician at 722. That conversation and all subsequent actions are time-stamped in the patient's chart. You contradicted my clinical assessment in a public corridor in front of residents. Presented clinical data that I was concerned the assessment had not accounted for. You called a rapid response that pulled Dr. Finch from her floor and created confusion in the handoff sequence. The rapid response was called at 809 when the patient's pressure dropped to 81/55. That is the exact threshold specified in this hospital's rapid response protocol. Every action I took was documented, time-stamped, and within the scope of my role. Doyle's expression didn't change. He had done this before she could see it in the way he was doing it now. The certainty. The performance of certainty. "You practiced medicine without a license," he said. "And a soldier is dead." The ER had gone completely still. Harriet was standing up behind the station. Tomas was at the edge of the room. Plytech near the far wall had stopped moving her cart mid-push. Sloane felt something settle inside her. Not calm. Something past calm. The thing that comes when you've been through enough genuinely terrible situations that you know the difference between something that is hard and something that is wrong, and you know which one this was. "I want to sit down with the chart together," she said. "Every timestamp, every notation, mine and yours, right now, in front of whoever you want in the room." Doyle looked at her. Just for a second, just a fraction of a second, something moved across his face. Not guilt, exactly. Something more functional, something calculating. Then it was gone. "You're done, Whitfield." He held out his hand, palm up. "Badge. On what grounds?" "Clinical insubordination." "Professionally negligent patient management. Failure to comply with attending physician directives." He said it with the evenness of a man reciting a list he'd prepared earlier. "HR will process the documentation." "You're terminating me for flagging a patient who was bleeding internally." "I'm removing you from duty pending an incident review." "I won't sign an incident report that misrepresents what happened." "My chart is accurate. All of it. If anyone alters it after the fact, I will know, because I have my own documentation." The air in the room was absolutely still. He lowered his hand. He looked at Harriet. "Call security." Harriet's jaw was tight. She looked at Sloane. Sloane reached up and unclipped her badge. She set it on the counter. She didn't slide it, didn't drop it. Set it down with intention. The small sound it made against the laminate surface was the only sound in the room. "I'm not signing anything," she said. "Not today, not after review, not under any version of this that has my name next to a statement I know is false." Picked up her bag. She kept her pace deliberate, kept her breathing even, kept the distance between what she felt and what showed on her face exactly as wide as she needed it to be. Through the ER floor, past the nurse's station where Harriet watched her, go with an expression that held too much in it for a single look. Through the automatic doors and into the ambulance bay where November air hit her like cold water. Stopped, closed her eyes. Let herself have exactly 5 seconds. Then she opened her eyes and walked toward the parking lot. She was in the second row. She could see her car, could already feel the particular relief of a closed door and no one watching her when the sound hit. Tires, multiple vehicles, moving with purpose. She turned. 3 black SUVs came off the service road in a tight formation, cutting across the painted lanes of the ambulance bay without slowing. Behind them, 2 Army transport vehicles and a government sedan with federal plates and no markings except the plates themselves. Convoy moved the way military convoys move, with the velocity of people who have already made every decision and are now executing them. Doors opened before the vehicles completely stopped. Sloane had seen this kind of movement before. Not in a hospital parking lot in Carthage, Virginia, but in other places, in other contexts, where the same principles applied. The way the perimeter personnel fanned out first. The way 2 of them went through the ER entrance before anyone else moved. The way the rear vehicle kept its engine running. The posture. The spacing. Military. Not uniformed, but recently enough military that it hadn't left them yet. A woman in a gray suit came out of the sedan and moved toward the ER entrance with the focused stride of someone who had been briefed in transit and was already 3 steps into execution. She spoke into a handheld radio, and Sloane caught enough of it to understand. "Trauma team, or standby 6-minute window. The middle transport vehicle's rear doors opened. The patient on the stretcher was large. Even lying flat, even unconscious, there was something about the physical presence that registered before anything else. Partial dress uniform, cut away at the torso, multiple IV lines, Army medics running alongside, one holding a fluid bag above shoulder height, the other with a stabilizing hand on the railing. The man's face was the specific pale of someone who had been losing blood for hours. Sloane didn't move toward the entrance. She didn't have a badge. She moved to the edge of the bay, where the sight line was better, and she watched the handoff, watched the Army medic's hands. The angle of the fluid bag, the way the receiving nurse from Crestfall took the chart with the careful speed of someone trying to look calm. She watched Doyle come through the ER entrance. He had straightened his coat, fixed his expression into the one he wore for audiences that mattered to him, authoritative, certain the expert arriving. He moved toward the stretcher. "I'll take this. Get him inside." The woman in the gray suit turned. "And you are?" "Doctor Marcus Doyle, Chief of Trauma Surgery, Crestfall Regional." She held his gaze a moment, longer than was strictly necessary. "He's been shot. We need him in surgery." Doyle looked at the wound sites, at the medic's report in the receiving nurse's hand. He shifted into the tone he used when he was processing information he wanted to control. "The presentation is consistent with blunt force impact. We'll confirm with imaging and assess from." "He's been shot," the woman said again. Cleaner, slower. Sloane wasn't planning to speak. She told herself that afterward, and she believed it, mostly. She was standing 20 feet away without a badge or a job or any standing in this situation. She was nobody here. She had been fired 40 minutes ago in front of the entire floor. But she looked at the wound on the patient's left flank. She looked at the angle, the margins, the specific way the surrounding tissue had responded. And she spoke before she consciously decided to. "That's not impact trauma." Everyone turned. The wound margins and trajectory angle are inconsistent with blunt force. If you treat it as an impact injury, you'll miss the internal track and you're going to lose him. Doyle turned fully toward her. His expression moved through disbelief and landed on something harder. She was removed from this facility 40 minutes ago. "Someone get security back." "Who are you?" The woman in the gray suit said it directly, cutting across Doyle without acknowledging him. "I'm the nurse who was just fired," Sloane said. "But I can see the entry wound from here, and I'm telling you that if his internal track is toward the iliac vessels, he's been bleeding into his abdominal cavity since whatever happened to him last night, and treating it as impact trauma will cost you the window you have left." Silence, the kind that fills a space completely. Near the rear vehicle, a man who hadn't spoken since the convoy arrived took 3 unhurried steps forward. Mid-50s, lean, the kind of face that had been in too many rooms that weren't photographed to show anything it didn't choose to show. He looked at her. "Your name," she told him. Something happened in his expression. Controlled, brief, but there. "Whitfield," he said. Not a question. Something else. He turned to the woman in the gray suit and said 4 words. "Get Doyle out now." Doyle's voice came out sharp. "I am the attending physician on this. Clear him." The man's voice was quiet. Didn't need to be anything else. 2 of the personnel near the entrance moved. Doyle's voice rose and then abruptly stopped being relevant to what was happening. The man turned back to Sloane. "Whitfield, with me." She had 4 seconds. 4 seconds while her brain ran the calculation: no badge, no position, no protection, no idea what she was walking into, or why this man knew her name, or what any of this connected to. 4 seconds while every reasonable version of self-preservation said to stay in the parking lot. She walked. The man moved alongside her, already talking. His name is Brigadier General Raymond Cook. Convoy ambush, last night south of the Federal Corridor. 2 killed. He was triaged as non-critical at the field site, which is why there's a 14-hour gap in his treatment. What are you seeing? Left flank wound, downward entry trajectory. Projectile tracked toward the iliac vessels or grazed the colon. He's had a slow bleed building since last night. Any abdominal imaging at the field site? Negative. Chest only. Then no one has seen what I think is there. She was already moving through the ER entrance, already pulling on the gloves being handed to her by someone whose face she didn't have time to look at. I need bedside ultrasound, fast protocol, and someone needs to have OR2 ready, because if I'm right about the track, we're not doing this in the trauma bay. Behind her, Doyle's voice reached her one more time. Still insistent, still certain, still the voice of a man who believed the room owed him its obedience. ER doors closed behind her and his voice disappeared. Sloane Whitfield, who had no badge, no job title, and had been publicly blamed for a patient's death less than an hour ago, walked into the trauma bay, where a general was bleeding from a wound nobody had correctly named yet. The man in civilian clothes walked half a step behind her. "How do you know who I am?" she said. "You'll understand that later." "That's not an answer." "No," he said. "It's not." The trauma bay doors opened, monitors alarming, voices calling vitals. Clean, antiseptic smell of a room where everything mattered. Pushed through. She put her hands on the patient and started working. And outside, somewhere beyond the ER doors, she had just walked through for possibly the last legitimate time, Dr. Persecoli. Marcus Doyle was being moved us away from a situation he had controlled for 6 years, and from the look on the face of civilian clothes, Sloane understood, in the back of her mind, where she was keeping that particular thought until she had time for it, that Doyle had not yet begun to understand what was coming for him. The trauma bay was loud in the specific way that critical resuscitations are loud, not chaotic, but layered. Monitors alarming at different intervals. Voices calling numbers across the room. The mechanical rhythm of the ventilator they'd already positioned near the head of the bed. Sloane moved into the space, and the noise reorganized itself around her the way it always did when she had a job to do it, became background, became data, became input rather than interference. The general was still breathing on his own, which was something. Color was worse than it had looked in the ambulance bay. Under the fluorescent lights, the gray in his face had a bluish undertone that meant his body was working harder than it had oxygen for. "Fast probe," she said, and someone put it in her hand. Who? She didn't look up. The probe was there, and that was what mattered. She pressed it below his left rib cage and moved it slowly, watching the screen. The bedside's ultrasound was a portable unit, older than she would have liked, with the kind of image quality that required you to know what you were looking for, because the machine wasn't going to make it obvious. She knew what she was looking for. There. A dark irregular crescent between the spleen and the kidney. Free fluid, blood pooling in the space it had no business being in. She moved the probe, checked the pelvis. More fluid. Not a little. How long ago was the ambush, she said. The man in civilian clothes she still didn't have. His name was standing just outside the bay. 2,100 hours last night. She did the math. 17 hours. 17 hours of slow bleeding with a field medic who had looked at the chest and called him stable. She understood why. In the field with limited imaging and a patient who was conscious and talking, you triaged what was visible. Spleen and the iliac vessels weren't visible. They were interior geography, and interior geography required tools that weren't always available. But now they had tools. He needs the OR, she said. Now, not in 5 minutes. The nurse on the other side of the bed, a younger man named Garrett, who she knew by face but barely by name, looked at her. "We don't have an attending cleared to take him. Where's Finch?" "Still in recovery from the last case." "Who else is on?" Dr. Doyle was the trauma attending. The silence that followed lasted about 2 seconds. "Get Finch," Sloane said. "Wake her up if you have to. Tell her what we have, and tell her he won't last another 20 minutes at current bleed rate." Garrett moved. Sloane kept her hands on the patient and kept her attention on the monitor. His pressure was 88/54. Heart rate 122. Not numbers you could sustain. Whitfield. She looked up. The man in civilian clothes had stepped fully into the bay doorway. He had a phone in his hand screen, lit, something on it she couldn't read from the angle. His name is Raymond Cook, Brigadier General, Army Medical Command. He's been in that role for 4 years. He paused. Before that, he was the commanding officer of the 24th Forward Surgical Team, Kandahar 2014 through 2016. Sloane's hands stilled for exactly 1 second. Then she kept working. I was attached to the 24th in 2015, she said. A question, not a revelation. Just a statement, flat and factual, delivered to the ultrasound screen. Because she wasn't ready to look anywhere else while she said it. I know, the man said. That's why you know my name. That's part of it. She pressed her fingers to the general's wrist, checked his pulse manually against the monitor reading, because she always double-checked manually when the numbers were moving this fast. The monitor was accurate. His radial pulse was thready and quick, the kind that meant the body was shunting blood to the core organs and letting the extremities manage on whatever was left. What's the other part? She said. He didn't answer immediately. She heard him shift his weight in the doorway. Let's get him stable first. Finch arrived 7 minutes later, still in her surgical cap from the previous case, a cup of coffee in her hand that she set down on the counter outside the bay and didn't touch again. She looked at the ultrasound screen. She looked at the vitals. She looked at Sloane. You're reading this as iliac involved? I'm reading it as significant intraperitoneal hemorrhage with a wound track that points toward the iliac region. Can't confirm without imaging or direct visualization, but his pressure curve over the last 17 hours is consistent with a slow bleed that's accelerating. Finch looked at the patient. She was quiet for a moment in the way that surgeons are quiet when they're making a real decision rather than a political one. Get him to OR2, she said. Call anesthesia. I want 4 units of packed red cells on the rapid infuser before we open him. She looked at Sloane again. You scrubbing in? Sloane looked down at herself. No badge, no official role. Technically not an employee of this hospital, as of she checked the clock on the wall approximately 73 minutes ago. I don't have credentials right now. I didn't ask about your credentials. I asked if you're scrubbing in. Finch picked up a chart and started writing. I've got a patient who needs to be opened, and I want the person in this room who identified the correct diagnosis in the room when I open him. You can argue about the paperwork later. Sloane looked at the man in the doorway. He gave her nothing. No nod, no instruction. Just watched. She looked back at Finch. Yes, she said. I'm scrubbing in. The surgery took 3 hours and 14 minutes. Sloane was not the surgeon. She was not the anesthesiologist. She was not, in any official capacity, anything. She stood across the table from Finch and did what she was asked to do, retracted, irrigated, monitored the field, called out pressure changes from the anesthesiologist's updates, and twice caught things before Finch asked for them because she had been in enough operating rooms, in enough countries, to read the rhythm of a surgery and anticipate what came next. Finch was good, precise and efficient, without being mechanical. She had that quality that the best surgeons had, where their focus didn't look like stress, even when the situation warranted stress. The iliac vessel had been partially lacerated, a clean injury from a small caliber round that had entered at a shallow angle, tracked through the abdominal wall, and nicked the external iliac artery before coming to rest against the iliac bone. Another 2 hours of bleeding, and the outcome would not have been operable. Finch repaired it. It took 11 minutes of the kind of focused silence that OR rooms reserve for the moments that matter most. When it was done, when the repair was confirmed, the field irrigated, the abdomen closed layer by layer. Finch stepped back from the table and took the kind of breath that means you didn't realize how shallow you'd been breathing for the past hour. Good call, she said. She was looking at the patient, not at Sloane. Sloane didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that wasn't either too much or too small. She found the man in civilian clothes in the surgical waiting area outside OR 2. He was sitting in one of the plastic chairs along the wall with the ease of someone who had spent a significant portion of their adult life waiting in institutional spaces. He had another phone call going when she came through the door, and he ended it the moment he saw her, which told her something about how this conversation had been ranked in his list of priorities. Across from him, she was still in scrubs they'd given her a set from the locker room, which was a small practical kindness that she was trying not to assign too much meaning to. He's out of surgery, she said. Finch got the vessel. Pressure is stabilizing. The man nodded. I know. They updated me. She looked at him. You're going to tell me who you are now. He was quiet for a moment, as if he was deciding where to start and what to leave out. Then Deputy Director Warren Ashby, Defense Intelligence, Domestic Operations. She waited. Raymond Cook is not just a brigadier general, Ashby said. He's the current chair of the Army Medical Accountability Review Board. In that capacity, he's been overseeing an internal investigation into falsified patient records, supply diversion, and systematic negligence cover-ups at military-affiliated medical facilities across the Eastern Corridor. Sloane kept her face still. That's a wide scope. It is. He leaned forward slightly, his elbows on his knees. 2 weeks ago, his review board received a batch of flagged records from a joint DoD hospital audit. Among them were records from Crestfall Regional, specifically related to a series of patient deaths over the past 14 months. The air in the waiting room felt different. The convoy ambush last night, Ashby continued, was not random. We have preliminary evidence that suggests it was coordinated. Cook was the only named target. Both soldiers who died in the ambush were in the forward vehicle. Cook's vehicle was hit, but the pattern of engagement was designed to look like an opportunistic attack. Wasn't. Sloane was quiet. She let the information settle the way you let something heavy settle carefully, making sure the surface underneath it could hold. Someone tried to kill him before he could release those records, she said. That's where we are right now. Ashby looked at her steadily, which is why the question of who identified the correct diagnosis in that trauma bay and how fast they identified it is not a small detail. He would have been dead in under 2 hours if he'd been treated for impact trauma. Doyle's assessment would have sent him to observation with pain management and monitoring while a lacerated iliac artery finished the job. Sloane looked at the floor. The linoleum had a scuff mark near the leg of the chair across from her that someone had tried to clean and hadn't quite gotten. She looked at it because it gave her something to look at while she arranged the things she was thinking. The records Cook was reviewing, she said. Are they from this hospital specifically? Among others, and the deaths. We're looking at 11 cases over 14 months, Ashby said. Deaths that were attributed to nursing error, treatment delay, or patient noncompliance. In every case, a physician's assessment was the last entry before the outcome. In every case, prior nursing documentation showed clinical concerns that were overridden. She knew the answer to the next question before she asked it. Who's the physician? Ashby looked at her. Doyle, she said. His name appears on 9 of the 11 records. He paused. Derek Holt is number 12. The waiting room was very quiet. Sloane sat with that for a moment. 12. Derek Holt, who had been 23 years old and had asked her at 8 Fower A. M. if he was going to be okay, and she had told him she wasn't going anywhere, was the 12th name on a list that someone had been building for over a year. She breathed through it. My documentation, she said. From this morning, we need it. I have copies. I always keep copies. She looked up. That's why you said that's part of it earlier. The other part isn't just that I was attached to the 24th. Ashby was quiet. You knew I was here, she said. You knew I worked at Crestfall. He didn't deny it. We've been monitoring personnel at facilities connected to the flagged records. Your name came up in the staff audit 3 weeks ago. He held her gaze. Your clinical documentation has been the most consistently detailed and time-stamped of any nursing staff at this facility. If anyone was maintaining an accurate record of what was actually happening in those trauma bays, it was going to be you. Sloane laughed. It came out short and without any real humor. I was fired this morning. I know. Doyle publicly blamed me for a patient's death in front of the entire ER floor. I know that too. She stood up. Not from agitation, she was past agitation, had moved through it somewhere in the last several hours, and come out the other side in a place that was quieter and considerably colder. She walked to the window at the end of the waiting room. The hospital's rear parking lot was below. A delivery truck was backing slowly toward the loading dock, its warning beeps reaching her faintly through the glass. He's going to amend the chart, she said. Holt's chart. He'll do it before end of business today if he hasn't already. Whatever timestamp record he needs to shift to make the narrative work, he'll shift it. We anticipated that. Ashby came to stand a few feet behind her. We already have a hold request submitted through the DoD audit channel. Crestfall's record system should be flagged within the hour. Any modifications attempted after that point will be logged with attribution. Turned. You moved fast. We've been ready to move for 3 weeks. Today gave us the specific cause. She looked at him. He changed the record for at least one of those 11 cases, didn't he? That's how you know the pattern. Not just bad outcomes, actively altered documentation. 2 confirmed alterations, 3 more suspected. We needed a current active case with original nursing documentation preserved independently to establish the pattern in real time. He stopped. Then, we didn't expect it to be today. We didn't expect Cook to be in that convoy or in this hospital. But here we are, she said. Here we are. She looked back out the window. The delivery truck had stopped. The driver was out, walking around the back, doing the job with no particular urgency, in the way that people do ordinary things in the middle of extraordinary circumstances, because ordinary things don't pause for what's happening inside a building. My notes from this morning, she said. I'll need to hand them to someone official. Not you. Someone with the right jurisdiction. Already in process. There'll be an investigator here within 2 hours. She nodded. She was doing calculations she didn't say out loud, the practical kind about what came next for her specifically. No job, no badge. A public accusation from a physician with 6 years of institutional authority behind him. A dead patient whose family was going to receive a record that, if Doyle had his way, would blame a nurse who had spent every minute of his last hours fighting for his life. She thought about Derek Holt's face at 8:04 a.m., dark brown eyes. The question underneath the actual question he'd asked. His family? She said. Holt's family, they're going to be told something today. Yes. Make sure they're told to keep whatever they receive. Whatever paperwork, whatever documentation, whatever version of events the hospital gives them. Make sure they don't sign anything without talking to someone first. Ashby looked at her. Something in his expression shifted, almost imperceptible. I'll make sure of it. She turned away from the window. The investigator arrived in 1 hour and 40 minutes, which was faster than Ashby had said. Which meant either the situation had elevated or someone had made a call she wasn't aware of. Her name was Special Agent Dana Morell, and she was younger than Sloane, had expected mid-30s, with the efficient, slightly humorless quality of someone who had learned early that warmth and rigor were easier to keep separate than to mix. She shook Sloane's hand once and sat across from her at the small table in the conference room. Ashby had appropriated. Walk me through this morning, Morell said. From the beginning. Every timestamp you have. Sloane walked her through it. She was careful. She was complete. She was the same way she'd been in other rooms in other institutional settings, where what she said was going to become part of a record that would outlast the conversation. She did not editorialize. She did not add conclusions that weren't supported by direct observation. She presented the sequence of events in the order they had occurred, with the timestamps she had documented and the verbatim language she remembered from each conversation. Morell wrote continuously. She interrupted twice, once to clarify the precise timing of Sloane's initial assessment versus the chart entry, and once to ask about the corridor conversation with Doyle. The words you used were, "He doesn't have until you're out of surgical," Morell said. And his response, he said, "That is not your determination to make." Then he said, "Chart your concern. That is what your role is." Those are his exact words. To the best of my recollection, yes. Morell made a note. "You mentioned you maintain personal documentation, separate from the hospital's system. Keep a clinical notebook, handwritten, time-stamped at the point of observation. It's a habit from my Army service." She pulled it from her bag, the same notebook she'd been writing in since 6:51 that morning, now with several additional pages from the surgery and the conversations after. She set it on the table. "I'm prepared to turn over the relevant pages. I'd like a copy made before I surrender the originals." Morell looked at the notebook, then at Sloane. "That's standard. We'll copy it before you leave. There's one more thing." Sloane kept her voice even. "Doyle terminated my employment at approximately 10:53 this morning and cited clinical insubordination and negligent patient management. I was escorted out. He will have already begun constructing his version of events, and he has access to the hospital's documentation system." She paused. "I assume you're aware that access has been flagged. The hold request was confirmed 48 minutes ago." Morell clicked her pen closed. "Any modifications to patient records at this facility attempted after 11:07 this morning are logged and attributable. Doyle may have tried to amend the record before then. We're checking the audit trail now." She stood. "You did the right thing, Nurse Whitfield. Documenting the way you documented, preserving what you preserved." Sloane looked at her. "A 23-year-old soldier is dead." Morell held her gaze. "Yes. So I'm not going to give myself credit for documentation." Morell nodded. Just once. Something in her expression changed, not softened exactly, but shifted into something more direct. "Understood." She gathered her materials. "We'll be in touch within 24 hours. Don't discuss the specifics of this conversation with anyone at this facility." She left. Sloane sat in the conference room alone for a moment. The fluorescent light above her had a subtle flicker she hadn't noticed while Morell was there. She noticed it now. She thought about what 11 cases meant. 11 people before Derek Holt. 11 outcomes that had been explained to families and colleagues and administrators as the cost of medicine, as the acceptable uncertainty that comes with trauma, with illness, with the difficult work of saving lives that couldn't always be saved. 11 people who might have had someone watching their monitor and writing timestamps and trying to get a physician to the bedside in time. She sat with that. Then she stood up. She picked up her bag. She walked out of the conference room and down the corridor toward the surgical floor, because there was one more thing she needed to do before she left Crestfall Regional for yet what might be the last time. General Cook was in recovery. The nurse at the station, a woman named Petra, who was back for an evening shift overlap, and who, to her considerable credit, did not ask a single question about why Sloane was there or what had happened, that morning told her he was stable and sedated and that vitals were holding. "His team is outside the room," Petra said. "The man in the gray suit." "Gray suit was a woman," Sloane said. "Different person. Gray suit. This one's a man. He's been there since they brought the general up from surgical." Sloane went down the hall. The man outside room for Ian was indeed wearing a gray suit, and he looked at her with the careful attention of someone whose entire job was whether people got through doors or didn't. "I was in the OR with him," she said. "I'm not staying. I just need 1 minute." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he stepped aside. She went in. The room was quiet. Machines monitoring, soft rhythmic sounds. The general was large even in a hospital bed, even unconscious, even reduced to the stillness of post-surgical sedation. His color was better than it had been. Not good, but better. The monitors showed a steady rhythm, a pressure that was climbing slowly back toward something sustainable. She stood at the foot of the bed for a moment. She wasn't sure why she'd come. She told herself it was professional confirmation of condition, closure on a case. But that wasn't entirely true. The other part of it was harder to name. Something about the fact that he had been in the 24th, that he had been in the same forward surgical team she had been attached to in 2015, in a different desert, in a different kind of urgency. That whoever he was now, whatever his title and his command responsibilities, there had been a version of him who had operated in the same context she had operated in. And that context left a particular kind of mark that she had always found it easier to recognize than to explain. Started to turn. His voice came out rough and low, barely above a whisper, the voice of a man surfacing from anesthesia one word at a time. Whitfield. She stopped, turned back. His eyes were open barely, just a slit, and clearly costing him significant effort. He was looking at her with the unfocused deliberateness of someone fighting the sedation for a specific purpose. General. I remember you, he said. The words came out slow, separated. Kandahar, the hit on the third convoy. You worked on Reyes for, he paused, breathed, 4 hours. On the ground, with artillery 2 kilometers out, stood very still. You refused to move him, he said. Everyone else was pulling back. You stayed. That was 11 years ago. I know. His eyes drifted, then steadied. I never forgot it. Another breath. Slower. The sedation pulling at him. Didn't know you were here until the audit. When your name came up in the records review, he stopped. Should have reached out. General, you need to rest. Doyle. The name came out with something behind it that wasn't quite strength, but was the shape of it. He's been doing this for... I know, she said. There are people handling it. His eyes were closing. The effort of the conversation was costing him more than he had to spend right now. You saved my life today, he said. It came out factual. Not grateful in a performative way, just accurate. The way men like him tended to state things. She looked at him. We're even then, she said quietly. He didn't respond. The sedation had taken him back under, his breathing steady and slow. She stood there one more moment. Then she walked out of the room, past the man in the gray suit, down the corridor, toward the elevator. Her phone buzzed in her bag. She pulled it out. An unknown number local area code, not a contact she had. She answered. Nurse Whitfield. The voice was male-clipped. Not Ashby, not Morell, someone she hadn't spoken to yet. This is Lieutenant Colonel Harlan Voss, Army JAG Corps. I've been assigned to General Cook's support detail. I need to speak with you as soon as possible. I just gave a full statement to Special Agent Morell. I'm aware. This isn't about your statement. A pause. Dr. Doyle filed a formal complaint against you 40 minutes ago with the Virginia Board of Nursing. He's claiming you performed unauthorized medical procedures on a patient after your employment was terminated, and that you misrepresented your credentials to gain access to a restricted surgical area. Another pause, shorter. He's also claiming the general's condition was worsened by your intervention, and that proper surgical outcomes were compromised. The elevator opened in front of her. She stood in the doorway and let it close again without getting in. She looked at the wall across from her. Beige, institutional. A small framed print of a coastal landscape that nobody had looked at in years. He filed it 40 minutes ago, she said. Yes, that's 20 minutes after Morell told me the record's hold was confirmed. I know. He moved faster than I thought he would. Dr. Doyle, Voss said, has a very experienced attorney who filed that complaint from a personal cell phone 12 minutes after Doyle made the call. It was not the first call they've made together. Sloane breathed. The nursing board complaint, she said. If it goes forward, will trigger an automatic review of your licensure pending investigation outcome. During review, you won't be able to practice. She looked at the coastal print on the wall. Somewhere on a beach very far from here, small painted waves were frozen mid-break. He's trying to make sure I can't testify, she said. Or that if I do, I'm already discredited. That is our assessment, yes. She stood in the corridor of a hospital she no longer worked at, holding a phone against her ear, doing the calculation of what this meant in practical terms. No job, no badge, a public accusation from the man whose patients kept dying. An amended version of Derek Holt's record that probably already existed somewhere in a draft Doyle hadn't had time to finalize. And now a formal nursing board complaint that would sit on her record and her license like a stone. She'd have to carry through everything that came next. 11 cases. 12 if you counted Derek, she breathed. Lieutenant Colonel Voss, she said. Tell me what you need from me. In person, he said. Tonight. Can you be at the Embassy Suites on Commerce Drive by 7? She checked the time on her phone. She had 4 hours and 20 minutes. Yes, she said. Come alone. Don't contact anyone at the hospital. And Nurse Whitfield, a pause. Careful and deliberate, doctor. Doyle does not know about the records audit. He doesn't know about the DOD investigation. He doesn't know that General Cook was specifically targeted. As far as Doyle's concerned, this is still a local employment dispute and a malpractice exposure issue that his attorney can manage. Okay. We'd like to keep it that way for the next 24 hours. Understood. One more thing. His voice dropped half a register. When you were in the OR with General Cook, he regained consciousness briefly. For about 90 seconds. He was sedated. We know. The recovery room nurse logged it. A pause. What did he say? Sloane looked at the frozen wave in the coastal print. He said he remembered me, she said, from Kandahar. Voss was quiet for a moment on the other end. Did he say anything else? He said. Anything specific? About Doyle? About the investigation? About what he'd found in the records review? She thought about the general's voice, slow and rough, pulling itself up through sedation, one word at a time. The way he'd stopped mid-sentence before finishing the thought about the audit. About finding her name in the records review. About what had he been about to say? I never forgot it. Should have reached out. Doyle. He's been doing this for minus. For how long? She hadn't let him finish. He said Doyle's name, she said. That was all. Then he went back under. Another silence on the line. All right, Voss said. 7 o'clock. Commerce Drive. He hung up. Sloane stood in the corridor for a moment longer. The elevator opened again beside her. Someone else's call going down, and she stepped into it this time, without thinking about it. The way you step into things. When the thinking has already been done, and what's left is just the moving. The doors closed. The elevator began to descend. And somewhere above her, in a hospital room on the 4th floor, Brigadier General Raymond Cook was breathing steadily through machines that were keeping him stable, a man who had seen her name in a records audit 3 weeks ago, who had been specifically targeted in a convoy ambush 14 hours before arriving at this hospital, who had regained consciousness long enough to say a name he hadn't finished explaining. He's been doing this for how long? That was the sentence he hadn't finished. That was the sentence Sloane was still carrying when the elevator opened at the ground floor. And she walked out into the hospital lobby and kept walking because the meeting was at 7 and she had 4 hours. And she needed to understand, before she walked into that room, exactly how long Marcus Doyle had been doing this and exactly how far up the chain someone had decided that a brigadier general needed to be dead before the answer could get out. She drove home on autopilot. 22 minutes on Route 9 through the same fog that had mostly cleared by now but left the road with a damp gray quality that matched the inside of her head. She didn't turn on the radio. She didn't call anyone. She went through the sequence of the day the way she went through clinical Start at the beginning. Follow each step to the next. Don't skip forward, because forward meant missing the thing that was sitting quietly between two other things waiting to be seen. Derek Holt, 6:51 a.m., rigid abdomen, progressive pain, climbing heart rate. Doyle, 7:22 a.m., chart your concern. That is what your role is. Derek Holt, 10:47 a.m., gone. General Cook, 15 minutes later. Left flank wound, 17 hours of slow bleed, a field triage that called him stable because nobody looked at the right place. And now, somewhere between those two events, a Defense Intelligence Deputy Director who had known her name before she spoke it, an Army JAG officer who called within 40 minutes of a nursing board complaint, and a physician who had filed that complaint through a personal attorney who was apparently on standby for exactly this kind of emergency. She pulled into her apartment complex and sat in the car for a moment without getting out. He's been doing this for how long was the question? But underneath that question was a worse one, the one she'd been keeping at arm's length all afternoon, because she hadn't had the space to look at it directly. If the DoD audit had flagged 11 cases over 14 months, and Doyle's attorney was already positioned to file a nursing board complaint within 40 minutes of a termination, then the preparation for that complaint had not started today. He had a playbook. He had used it before, which meant somewhere in those 11 cases is someone else had been where Sloane was right now, stripped of their badge, publicly accused, professionally isolated, before they could speak clearly enough to be heard. She got out of the car. She had 2 hours before she needed to leave for Commerce Drive. She spent the first 40 minutes at her kitchen table with her clinical notebook open, going through every page she had written since 6:51 a.m. and comparing it against her memory of the chart entries she'd made in real time on Crestfall's system. The notebook was handwritten her own shorthand, developed over years, dense with abbreviations that would require translation, but were unambiguous to anyone who understood clinical notation. The timestamps matched her memory exactly. She had trained herself to note the time at the beginning of every observation because time was the thing that got contested later. She also had something else. At 7:22 a.m., standing in the surgical corridor while Doyle told her to chart her concern and let him do his job, she had made a decision that she hadn't fully processed as a decision. In the moment, it had felt more like reflex. She had taken out her phone and, as Doyle walked away, recorded the last 40 seconds of the conversation. Not the beginning, not the part where she presented her clinical findings. Just the end. Chart your concern. I have a patient on the table. You're a nurse, Whitfield. Act like one. She had done it because she had been in enough situations where what someone said and what they later claimed to have said were two different things. And she had learned that the gap between those two versions was where careers went to disappear. Pulled up the recording now. 43 seconds. The audio was clear enough. Hospital corridors were not quiet, but Doyle had been standing close, and his voice had that carrying quality that people with long institutional authority tend to develop. That is not your determination to make. Clear, chart your concern. Clear, you're a nurse, Whitfield. Act like one. She listened to it twice. Then she made 2 copies, one to her personal cloud storage, one to an encrypted folder she kept on a drive that lived in her bedside drawer. Then she sat back and thought about what she had and what it meant. The recording was 43 seconds of a physician dismissing a clinical concern in a way that was professionally arrogant, but not, on its own, criminal. What made it meaningful was the context around it, the timestamps in her notebook showing a patient's deteriorating condition, the chart entries she'd made before and after the conversation, the rapid response call that came 47 minutes later, and Derek Holt's death at 10:47 a.m. The recording wasn't the case. The recording was the frame around the case. Case was 11 people over 14 months, and whatever was in those records that General Cook had been reviewing before someone put a convoy in his path. closed her notebook, changed out of the scrubs she was still wearing, put on clothes that were clean and not institutional, made herself eat something bread and leftover soup, standing at the kitchen counter, because she hadn't eaten since 6A. In her hands had developed a tremor that she recognized as blood sugar rather than emotion, and addressed accordingly. Then she drove to Commerce Drive. Lieutenant Colonel Harlan Voss was not what she'd pictured from the phone call. He was compact and slightly rumpled, the kind of man whose uniform probably looked impeccable and whose civilian clothes never quite fit the same way. He was sitting at the small desk in the hotel room with a laptop open, and two other people she hadn't been told about a woman she didn't recognize, and Warren Ashby, who gave her a single nod when she came in and then went back to looking at whatever was on the laptop screen. Nurse Whitfield. Sit down. Voss gestured at the chair across the desk. This is Agent Teresi Okafor, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Organized Crime and Corruption. She's been read into the Cook investigation as of this afternoon. Okafor was tall, early 40s, with the particular stillness of someone who spent a great deal of time in rooms listening to other people talk. She shook Sloane's hand without standing. We'll get to why she's here, Voss said. First, your recording. Sloane looked at him. How do you know about the recording? We don't, but you're the kind of person who makes recordings in corridors, so I'm asking. She looked at him for a moment. Then she pulled out her phone and played it. All 43 seconds. Nobody spoke while it played. When it finished, Okafor and Voss exchanged a look that lasted about a second and a half and communicated something she wasn't meant to parse. I need that file, Okafor said. You'll have it. What's the FBI doing in a military records audit? The audit opened the military side, Okafor said. We opened something else. 18 months ago, we started tracking a medical supply diversion network operating through 4 private hospitals in Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware. High-value items, blood products, surgical-grade equipment, specific pharmaceutical compounds, diverted from hospital stock, sold through intermediary channels to non-regulated buyers. She paused. Crestfall Regional appeared in our supply chain analysis 14 months ago. Sloane sat very still. The deaths, she said. Doyle's cases. They weren't just negligence. Some of them were negligence, Okafor said. Convenient negligence. Patients whose treatment was delayed or mismanaged in ways that were easy to attribute to clinical complexity. 4 of the 11 cases involved patients who were receiving specific blood products or medications at the time of their deaths. Products that our supply chain analysis shows were diverted from Crestfall's inventory during the same time frame. The room had a particular quality now, the kind that comes when a thing you half understood becomes something you fully understand. He was diverting supplies and then managing the outcomes, Sloane said, and amending the records to cover the gap between what a patient should have received and what they actually received, Voss said. Altered records weren't just about blame shifting. They were about concealing inventory discrepancies. Who else at the hospital? Voss and Okafor exchanged that look again. We have evidence implicating the hospital's director of operations, Okafor said. A man named Gordon Price. He's been at Crestfall for 9 years. He controls purchasing, inventory, and internal audit scheduling. She folded her hands on the table. He also controls HR, including employment actions. Sloane thought about that. Doyle couldn't fire nurses on his own, she said. Not without HR sign-off. Price would have had to process every termination. Yes, and the incident reports. The formal complaints that went into personnel files. Those would route through Price's office. So when Doyle went after nurses who were documenting accurately, nurses who were creating a paper trail that didn't match the amended records, Price was the mechanism. That's what we believe, Voss said. We need to prove it, which is part of why your documentation from today is significant. You're not just a witness to Derek Holt's case. You're potentially evidence of the operational pattern, how they identify a threat to the cover-up and move to neutralize it. Sloane looked at the wall behind Voss's head. Nursing board complaint, she said. Filed through an attorney named Warren Tully, who has represented Doyle in 2 prior malpractice actions. Okafor had a file open in front of her now. Tully's firm has also done work for 3 other hospital systems. In 2 of those systems, nursing staff who raised concerns about physician practice were subsequently subject to board complaints or licensing reviews. She looked up. Playbook, as you suspected. They've used it at least 4 times. 4 times. 4 versions of this. 4 people who had documented clinical concerns and then found their professional standing dismantled through channels that looked institutional, looked procedural, looked like the system working, the way the system was supposed to work, while the actual purpose was to make them impossible to believe. Did any of them keep documentation? Sloane asked. 2 did, 1 partially, 1 comprehensively. Voss leaned forward. The one with comprehensive documentation is a former OR nurse named Paula Reinhold. She worked at St. Edmund's Medical Center in Annapolis. She was terminated 18 months ago following a formal complaint about a physician's failure to respond to pre-surgical alerts on a patient who subsequently died. He paused. She's been fighting the licensing review ever since. She has notebooks very similar to yours. I want to talk to her. We anticipated that. She's agreed to be contacted. But not tonight. Voss sat back. Tonight, we need to discuss what happens in the next 72 hours, because the timeline is moving faster than we planned. Because of the convoy, Sloane said. Because of the convoy, and because Doyle moved faster than we expected. The nursing board complaint changes things. If we let the review process go forward, your credibility as a witness is compromised before the investigation goes public. If we accelerate the investigation to protect your standing, we risk alerting Price before we have everything we need on the supply chain. Ashby, who had been silent since she arrived, spoke for the first time. There's a third problem. Everyone looked at him. The convoy ambush, he said. Our preliminary analysis confirmed this afternoon that it was coordinated. 3-person team, military-grade planning, specific timing around Cook's route. This was not someone acting alone, and it was not improvised. He closed the laptop. The level of operational sophistication required to pull off a targeted ambush on a flag officer's convoy suggests resources that go beyond a hospital administrator and a physician covering a supply diversion scheme. The room was very quiet. You're saying someone else is involved, Sloane said. I'm saying the supply diversion network that Okafor's team has been tracking has buyers. Those buyers have resources. And General Cook's review board was not just looking at Crestfall's records, they were looking at records across 7 facilities. If the full scope of what Cook had assembled were to become public evidence, the exposure would extend well beyond Marcus Doyle. Sloane sat with that. She was a trauma nurse from a military background sitting in a hotel room on Commerce Drive in Carthage, Virginia, and the thing she had walked into this morning at 6:47 a.m., when she noticed a soldier's abdomen was wrong, had apparently been connected, in ways she still didn't fully see the edges of, to something considerably larger than one physician's arrogance. She breathed. "What do you need me to do?" she said. What they needed was specific, and she understood it clearly by the time she drove home at 10:40 p.m. She would not contact anyone at Crestfall Regional. She would not respond to the nursing board. Complaint directly, Voss had already connected her with a JAG-affiliated attorney who would handle the procedural response. She would document everything she remembered from every patient interaction she could recall that involved Doyle's overrides of her clinical assessments going back to her first month at Crestfall. Every case. Every conversation she could reconstruct. Every discrepancy she had noticed and either flagged or been overruled on. She would have 48 hours. She went home and started writing. She wrote through the night. Not continuously, she slept for 3 hours between 2 and 5, lying on top of her bed in her clothes, waking to an alarm she'd set because she knew herself well enough to know she wouldn't wake without one when she was running on this particular kind of adrenaline. She made coffee. She went back to the table. She had 11 months of memory to work through. 11 months of mornings and overnight calls and moments in corridors and documentation entries that had been made with precision and then, presumably, overridden or amended by a man with system access and a well-practiced story. What she remembered was more than she'd expected. The body remembered things the conscious mind had filed away as routine. The texture of a specific patient interaction, the exact phrasing a physician had used to dismiss a concern, the moment in a rapid response, when the response itself had been slowed by a set of circumstances that, at the time, had seemed like ordinary institutional friction, and, in retrospect, a different shape. She wrote it all, chronologically, time-stamped where she had dates, approximated where she didn't, flagged clearly which was which. By 8:30 a.m. the following morning, she had 23 pages. She photographed each page, uploaded them to the encrypted folder, and sent the access credentials to Voss and Okafor through the secure channel Okafor had set up the previous night. Then she sat back and looked at the table. 23 pages, 11 months. One building, one physician, one administrator, and a supply chain that fed something she still didn't have the full picture of. Her phone rang. It was Okafor. "We have a problem," Okafor said without preamble. "What happened?" Cook woke up 2 hours ago, fully lucid. His first coherent request was to speak to the lead investigator on the records audit, which is a major named Lena Ferris from the Army Inspector General's office. A pause. His second request was to speak to you. Me. He said there's something in the records he needs to explain in person. Something he found 3 days before the convoy. Okafor's voice had the careful quality of someone delivering information they haven't fully processed yet. He says he couldn't put it in the formal review documentation because he wasn't sure who else on the review board was clean. Sloane set down her coffee. He thought someone on his own board was compromised, she said. That's what he's saying now, which means the information he was carrying, whatever he found 3 days ago, he's been carrying it alone. Another pause. He wants to brief you first. Before Ferris, before Voss, before anyone else. He says, you'll understand why when he tells you. I don't have credentials to be in that building. Voss is working on a temporary authorization. You'd be going in as a medical consultant attached to the investigation. Okafor cleared her throat. Can you be at Crestfall in 90 minutes? Sloane looked at the 23 pages spread across her table. Coffee going cold beside them. At the window, where the morning light was coming through, gray and flat and ordinary, the way mornings came through when the world was doing something extraordinary inside them. Yes, she said. The temporary authorization was a single-page document with a DoD letterhead and 3 signatures she didn't recognize. The man who delivered it to her at the hospital entrance was one of the personnel from the convoy, and she recognized his posture before she recognized his face. He didn't introduce himself. He handed her the document, a temporary badge, and a floor pass, and then he positioned himself 2 steps behind her as she walked through the entrance. Crestfall Regional looked exactly the same. That was the thing about hospitals. They absorbed extraordinary things without changing their surfaces. The lobby was the same lobby. The elevator had the same slight mechanical complaint on the way up. The 4th floor corridor smelled the same as it had smelled 16 hours ago when she'd walked through it without a badge and stood at the foot of a general's bed. There was a different man outside room 14. She went through. Cook was sitting up. Not fully the bed was elevated, and he had the careful stillness of a man whose body had recently been opened and resealed and was expressing its opinion about that, but sitting aware, with the eyes of someone who had come back from the sedation fully and was now operating at whatever capacity the situation required of him. He looked at her when she came in. "Close the door," he said. Closed it. She sat in the chair beside the bed, the same chair she'd stood near 17 hours ago when he'd surfaced through anesthesia and found her name from 11 years of memory. He looked different awake, more specific. The person behind the rank. "I'm going to tell you something that isn't in any report," he said. His voice was rough but clear. "I need you to understand it before it goes anywhere official, because once it goes official, the people who need to be warned are going to be warned." Understood. 3 days ago, I was reviewing personnel cross-references in the flagged records. Looking for patterns, specifically, looking for whether the nursing staff involved in the flagged cases had anything in common beyond the facility. He shifted slightly. Something in the movement told her it cost him. "I found a pattern. Every nurse who filed a formal clinical concern that was subsequently overridden by a physician on the flagged list, every single one had their personnel file accessed within 72 hours of filing that concern." Sloane waited. "Not by HR," Cook said, "by an external access point. A user credential that ran through Crestfall's administrative system but originated outside the hospital network." He looked at her steadily. "I traced it. It took me 2 days and a favor from a signals analyst who doesn't know why I was asking. The external access point connects to a consulting firm called Meridian Health Partners." "I've heard that name," Sloane said slowly. "They do compliance consulting for hospital systems. Among other things, Meridian Health Partners has contracts with 11 hospital facilities across 4 states. All 11 of them appear in our flagged records review." He paused. "They also have a subsidiary that operates a medical supply brokerage. Not publicly listed. It took my analyst 4 hours to find the corporate structure." Sloane felt something shift in her chest. Not surprise, exactly. Shape of something she'd been approaching without knowing the name for it. "This supply diversion," she said. "Meridian is the buyer," Cook said. "They've been purchasing diverted medical supplies from hospital contacts at 6 of the 11 facilities, reselling them through the brokerage to non-regulated distributors, and using their compliance consulting contracts as cover for the financial flows." He stopped, breathed carefully. "Marcus Doyle has been a paid consultant for Meridian Health Partners for 4 years. She let that land. "He's not running the scheme," she said. "He's one node in it. He's the Crestfall node. Gordon Price is another. There are equivalent pairs at 5 other facilities that we know of." He looked at the door, then back at her. "This isn't a physician covering negligence. This is an organized network using hospital systems as extraction points for controlled medical supplies, managing the evidence trail through record alteration, and eliminating institutional threats through coordinated professional destruction." "And the convoy." "Meridian has investors," he said quietly. "Private equity, mostly non-disclosed. The moment my review board scope became clear, the moment it was apparent that we weren't looking at isolated cases, but at a network, someone made a calculation." He stopped. "I received an anonymous communication 4 days before the ambush. It said my review board had been compromised. It said if I released the full findings, I wouldn't have the opportunity to release them twice." She looked at him. "You kept going anyway." "I moved the critical files off the review board server onto a personal encrypted drive," he said. 3 days ago, the night before the convoy." He reached toward the bedside table, slowly, carefully, and opened the drawer. Inside was a small black drive, the size of a thumb, sitting against the wood like it had been placed there deliberately. "This was in my jacket pocket when they brought me in. Whoever admitted me apparently didn't know what it was." She looked at the drive. "What's on it?" she said. "Full record cross-reference. Personnel file access logs. The Meridian corporate structure and supply chain documentation. Financial flows we could reconstruct. And the names." He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them. 31 names across 6 facilities. Physicians, administrators, and 3 people inside Meridian's executive structure. That needs to go to Okafor and Voss immediately. I know. That's not why I wanted to talk to you first. He looked at her with the directness of someone who didn't have energy for anything that wasn't direct. Your name is in the access logs, Whitfield. Your personnel file was accessed from the Meridian External Point on November 3rd. That was 8 days ago. 8 days ago. 11 days before this morning. They knew I was documenting accurately, she said. Came out flat. Not a question. They pulled your file, presumably assessed the risk, and then Doyle fired you the first opportunity he had. He looked at her. He didn't fire you because of Derek Holt. He was waiting for a case he could use as justification. Holt was the pretext. She sat with that. Outside room 14, the corridor went on doing its hospital things. Carts rolling. Voices at a professional volume. The ordinary machinery of a building full of people who mostly had no idea what was happening in this room. The drive, she said. We need to get that to Okafor directly. Not through the hospital system. Not through anyone at Crestfall. Agreed. He held it toward her. Take it. She looked at his hand. The drive. If I walk out of this hospital with that. You're a DOD-authorized medical consultant attached to an active federal investigation. Whatever legal exposure that creates is Voss's problem to solve. He kept his hand extended. Take it, Whitfield. I've been keeping it alive for 3 days. I need it to be somewhere they can't reach it. She took it. It was lighter than it had any right to be, given what was on it. Closed her fingers around it. I'll contact Okafor from the parking lot, she said. Directly, no intermediary. Good. He lowered his hand. There's one more thing. One of the 31 names. He paused. She had the distinct sense he was other to tell her. Still, even now. It's not a physician, and it's not an administrator. She waited. It's an Army officer, he said. A colonel. He's currently assigned to the DOD Medical Accountability Division. Another pause. He's also the officer who authorized the staffing audit at Crestfall 3 weeks ago. The one that flagged your documentation as significant. He looked at her steadily. Which means someone inside the division that's supposed to be investigating this has been feeding Meridian information about who we were looking at and why. The room felt very small. They knew about the audit, she said. They've known since it started. Then they knew your review board was getting close. Yes. And the anonymous communication you received the warning 4 days before the convoy was either genuine from someone inside who wanted me out, or it was designed to make me move the files off the server. He said it carefully. Either way, the result was the same. I moved the critical evidence onto a personal drive that I had in my possession when a coordinated ambush put me on a hospital table in a city where the trauma physician on call had been waiting for a reason to make a particular nurse disappear. The silence in the room had a different quality now. Sloane looked at the drive in her hand. 31 names. A network across 6 facilities. A colonel inside the very division that had authorized the investigation. And a small black drive that a general had kept in his jacket pocket through an ambush and a surgery, and 17 hours of slow internal bleeding because he hadn't known until this morning who he could trust to give it to. He had asked for her. She understood now why. She stood up. I'm going to the parking lot, she said. I'm calling Okafor, and I need you to not tell anyone else what you just told me. Not Voss, not Ferris, not the man standing outside your door until I've had 20 minutes to get this information to the right place. Cook looked at her. His face had the particular exhaustion of a man who had been running on will for 3 days, and was now for the first time allowing himself to stop. 20 minutes, he said. She moved toward the door. Whitfield. She stopped. The colonel's name, he said. The one inside the division. His name is Bryson. Colonel Dale Bryson. He held her gaze. He's the officer who told Warren Ashby to reach out to you yesterday morning. Before the convoy even arrived at Crestfall, she stood at the door with her hand on the handle. She thought about the ambulance bay, the convoy arriving. Ashby stepping forward and saying her name before she'd said it herself. Whitfield, not a question. She thought about the 4 hours between the convoy's arrival and the meeting on Commerce Drive. Ashby sitting in the surgical waiting room. Ashby making the phone call he'd ended the moment she walked through the door. She thought about Voss, who had called her 40 minutes after the nursing board complaint was filed, who had known about her recording before she offered it, who had asked what the general said when he woke up. She turned back slowly. "You think Ashby is involved," she said. Cook's expression didn't change. It didn't need to. "I think Bryson told Ashby to bring you inside the investigation. Before the investigation could go anywhere, you weren't being managed," he said. "I think the reason they wanted your documentation was not entirely to use it as evidence." He stopped. "And I think you need to make that call to Okafor without telling Ashby you're making it." She stood in the doorway of room 14 with a drive in her closed fist that contained 31 names. In a hospital she'd been fired from yesterday morning. 20 minutes from the moment she'd promised a general she'd use wisely. Somewhere in the building, Warren Ashby was waiting for her to come back from this conversation and report what had been said. She walked out of the room without looking back, and she did not go toward the elevator that Ashby would expect her to use. And she did not go toward the exit closest to where the man with the posture of military personnel was standing in the lobby. She went the other way. The 4th-floor corridor had 2 exits, the main elevator bank near the nurses' station, which was where Ashby would expect her to appear, and a secondary stairwell at the far end near the linen storage and the housekeeping alcove. She had learned the secondary stairwell on her 3rd day, working the 4th floor, because she had always made a habit of knowing where the other exit was. In the Army, it had been tactical. In nursing, it was mostly about avoiding people in hallways when you were running behind. Now it was both. She pushed through the stairwell door and took the stairs at a pace that wasn't running, but was close to it, her hand closed around the drive, her phone already out. She hit the landing between 3 and 2 and stopped, back against the wall, and called Okafor. It rang twice. "Whitfield, you're supposed to be in the building." "I am in the building. I need you to listen carefully and not tell anyone I'm calling you. Specifically not Ashby. Can you do that right now?" A pause. Short, precise. "Yes. Cook gave me a drive. Physical storage device. Contains the full cross-reference from his records review, personnel access logs, the Meridian corporate structure, supply chain documentation, and 31 names across 6 facilities." She kept her voice low and even. "He's been carrying it since 3 days before the convoy, because he believed his review board was compromised." She heard Okafor's breathing change. Not dramatically, just the slight shift of someone recalibrating in real time. "Where are you?" "Stairwell between 3 and 4. Can't give this to Ashby. Cook told me Bryson directed Ashby to bring me into the investigation before it could move anywhere outside their visibility." One of the 31 names on that drive is Colonel Dale Bryson, assigned to the DoD Medical Accountability Division. Pause this time was longer. "How certain is Cook?" He traced the external access point himself with an independent signals analyst. "He didn't use division resources." She pressed her shoulder blades against the concrete wall. Above her, the door to the 4th floor was closed and quiet. "I need you to send someone to this building right now who doesn't route through Ashby's chain. Someone you trust completely. I need to hand this device to them directly." "Give me 6 minutes," Okafor said. "I don't know how long before Ashby realizes I didn't come back through the main corridor." 6 minutes. Stay in the stairwell. She stayed in the stairwell. It was 5 minutes and 40 seconds by her phone screen before the stairwell door below her opened, and a woman she recognized came through it not from this investigation, but from the ER the previous morning. The agent who had been with the convoy, gray suit, efficient stride. She looked up and saw Sloane and came up the stairs without hurrying. "Okafor sent me," she said. "She says you have something." Sloane opened her hand. The woman looked at the drive, produced an evidence bag from her jacket pocket, the small sealed kind, pre-labeled. She took the drive from Sloane's palm with gloved fingers and sealed it without touching it further. She wants you in a vehicle, not inside the building. The parking structure, level 2, gray sedan row C. Ashby is somewhere on this floor. We know. Go. The gray sedan on level 2 row C had Okafor in the passenger seat and a man Sloane had never seen before behind the wheel. She got in the back. Nobody spoke while the driver moved the car to the ramp and down to the street. They drove 3 blocks before Okafor turned around. Tell me exactly what Cook said. All of it, Sloane told her. She was precise and complete, and she did not editorialize, which was difficult in places, because some of what she was saying had implications she was still working through herself. Okafor listened without interrupting. When Sloane finished, Okafor was quiet for 10 seconds, a genuine 10 seconds, which in a moving car with an active federal investigation behind it was a long time. Bryson, Okafor said. Yes, Bryson authorized the audit. If he's been feeding Meridian information about the audit's scope, minutes. Then Meridian has known since the beginning what Cook's review board was finding and where it was finding it, Sloane said. They've had months to prepare. The nursing board complaint, the terminations, the record alterations, they weren't reactive. They were part of a prepared response. And Ashby. I don't know how deep it goes with Ashby. Cook, said Bryson, directed him to bring me inside. That doesn't necessarily mean Ashby knows what Bryson is. Okafor looked at the window for a moment. It means we can't assume he doesn't. No. She turned back. The drive goes to my direct supervisor and nobody else. I'm pulling 2 agents who've had 0 contact with this investigation's DOD side, and we're standing up a parallel track as of right now. She looked at Sloane steadily. You're going to need to stay visible. If you disappear from Ashby's sightline, he'll know something shifted. You want me to go back in. I want you to go back in, find Ashby, and tell him Cook was tired and wanted to rest, that the conversation was general. He thanked you, spoke about Kandahar, nothing operationally significant. She held Sloane's gaze. Can you do that? Sloane thought about what it meant to say no versus what it meant to say yes. Both options had weight. The yes was heavier in the immediate moment and lighter in every moment after it. Yes, she said. Ashby was in the 4th floor waiting area when she came off the elevator. He was standing near the window with his phone to his ear, and he ended the call when he saw her, which was exactly what she'd done to him the previous evening, and which she found, under the circumstances, grimly informative. How is he? Ashby said. Tired. He wanted to talk about Kandahar. She kept her voice and her face at exactly the level of mild professional debrief. Not too flat, not too warm. He thanked me for the OR. Spoke about the 24th. He drifted back off before we got to anything substantive. We watched her. He had the eyes of a man who processed information carefully, who had spent a career reading rooms. And she kept her own gaze direct and steady, because she had learned in different rooms, in different contexts, that the worst thing you could do when someone was watching you closely was to look like you were managing how you looked. Nothing about the investigation. He's on post-surgical sedation. He was lucid for maybe 10 minutes. She shrugged. It was exactly the right size of shrug, not dismissive, not performative. Just a shrug. I think he needed to close a loop. Kandahar. The 24th. That was what it was for him. Ashby nodded slowly. Voss wants to debrief you before you leave, he said. It's fine. Where is he? Conference room, ground floor. She went. She sat across from Voss professionally, and faxed from Voss for 40 minutes and gave him a version of the morning that was accurate in all its omissions. She described Cook's condition, his brief lucidity, the conversation about Kandahar, the general's fatigue. She said nothing about the drive. She said nothing about Bryson. She watched Voss's face for the particular quality of a man who is listening for something specific, and she could not be certain whether she saw it or whether she was looking for it hard enough to almost see it regardless. When she left the hospital at 1:15 p.m., she drove 2 miles, parked in a grocery store lot, and sent Okafor a single-word text. Done. Okafor's response came 4 minutes later. We have it. Stand by. Standby lasted 31 hours. She spent most of it at her kitchen table. Writing the additional documentation, Okafor had requested the full 11 months, every case she could reconstruct, organized by date and by the nature of Doyle's involvement. She had sent the initial 23 pages the day before. The complete version ran to 41. She slept in fragments. She ate when she remembered to. She checked her phone at intervals that got shorter as the hours accumulated, which was a bad habit, and she knew it. But knowing didn't stop the checking. On the second morning at 6:20 a.m., Okafor called. The drive checked out, she said. All of it. Our technical team authenticated the data overnight. The Meridian corporate structure, the supply chain, the access logs, it's a complete evidentiary package. A pause that had something different in it than the pauses from previous calls. We also ran the personnel file access logs against our own investigation records. The external access point that Cook traced to Meridian, it accessed 9 personnel files across 3 facilities. All 9 individuals had filed clinical consenters within the previous 30 days. All 9 were subsequently subject to formal complaints or terminations. Sloane stood at her kitchen window. The morning outside was cold and pale, the trees behind her building stripped to their November shapes. How many are still fighting licensing reviews? She said. 3 had their complaints dropped at earlier stages, 2 of those after the involved physician left the facility. Okafor paused. Paula Reinhold is one of the 6. Her licensing review has been ongoing for 18 months. And Bryson. We executed a search warrant on Bryson's government devices at 400 this morning. The pause this time was the kind that preceded something significant. We found communication records, encrypted, but our technical team cracked the encryption by 530. He was in direct contact with 2 Meridian executives from 14 months ago to 6 weeks ago. Communication records include advance notice of Cook's review board findings and specific identifications of review board staff whose reports were unfavorable to Meridian-connected facilities. He was feeding them the review board's work, in real time in some cases. Okafor's voice stayed level, but there was something underneath the level. He was also in communication with Meridian's legal counsel 3 days before the convoy ambush. Sloane's hand tightened around the phone. The ambush, she said. We cannot yet establish direct evidence of Bryson ordering or coordinating the ambush. What we can establish is that he communicated Cook's name, his travel schedule for that week, and the fact that Cook had moved critical files off the review board server to Meridian's legal counsel 72 hours before the ambush. She stopped. We're working with the FBI's counterterrorism division on the ambush investigation. This is no longer a medical fraud case. When does it move? Sloane said. This afternoon. Multiple simultaneous actions. Bryson is already in custody. Warrants are being executed at Meridian's corporate offices in 3 states as we speak. Another pause. Doyle and Price will be arrested at Crestfall Regional between 2 and 3 p.m. We want you to know before it happens publicly. Sloane looked at the trees outside, bare and winter pale, entirely themselves. Ashby, she said, under investigation. Not yet charged. We don't have sufficient evidence to establish knowing participation as opposed to directed action following Bryson's instructions. Okafor's voice was careful here. He may be a victim of Bryson's manipulation rather than a co-conspirator. That determination is ongoing. Okay, there's going to be press, Okafor said. Starting this afternoon, when the arrests happen, your name will come up. You were the nurse who was terminated. You identified Cook's injury. You're in the documentation record. She paused. Do you have someone you can be with today? Sloane thought about that. I'll be fine. That's not what I asked. She looked at the kitchen. The 41 pages on the table. The cold coffee. The bread she'd been eating for 2 days, because it didn't require her to cook anything. "I'll call someone," she said. She didn't call anyone. She watched it on the news instead. It started at 2:47 p.m. A brief factual bulletin from a local Carthage affiliate about a federal law enforcement action at Crestfall Regional Medical Center. 3:15, there were cameras outside the hospital entrance. By 4:00, the national affiliates had picked it up, and the framing had expanded from local law enforcement action to federal fraud investigation involving multiple hospital facilities across 4 states. 4:23, Doyle appeared on camera. Not in handcuffs, the cameras caught him being escorted through the hospital's staff entrance, which was around the side and away from the main press line, but someone with a camera had positioned themselves correctly. He was in his white coat. He was not in handcuffs yet, that came later, in the parking lot, after the formal arrest processing, but the footage of him in the white coat, escorted by federal agents through the door of a hospital where he had operated uncontested for 6 years, played on a 4-second loop on the lower half of the screen while the anchor explained what federal fraud charges meant and what the DOD investigation had uncovered. Sloane watched it once. Then she turned off the television. She sat in the quiet of her apartment and let the day settle around her. Outside, the afternoon was doing its afternoon things, entirely indifferent. A dog barked 2 apartments over. A car alarm went off briefly and then stopped. The building's heating system made its periodic knocking sound in the wall. She thought about Derek Holt. She thought about him at 8:04 a.m., asking if he was going to be okay, and she thought about what it meant that the answer to that question had been decided not by his injury or by the limits of medicine, but by a set of choices made by men who had calculated that his death was manageable and her silence was purchasable. She thought about Paula Reinholt in Annapolis, 18 months into a licensing review, writing her own notebooks in her own kitchen. She picked up her phone and called the number Voss had given her for the G-affiliated attorney handling her nursing board response. "The situation has changed," she said, when the attorney answered. "I assume you've seen the news." "I've seen it," he said. His voice had a different quality than it had in their first conversation. Less careful, more direct. "The nursing board complaint from Doyle's attorney will almost certainly be withdrawn by end of week. The attorney filed it on Doyle's instruction, and Doyle is currently under federal arrest. No attorney is going to sustain a complaint filed by a client facing criminal charges for the conduct that precipitated the complaint. And my license. Your license is intact. The review process hasn't formally started. The complaint was filed 48 hours ago, and reviews take 30 days to initiate. Given the circumstances, I'm confident we can have it dismissed before it formally opens." He paused. "There may also be grounds for a counteraction against the individuals who filed the complaint, given what the federal investigation has established about the pattern of weaponizing the board complaint process." "I'll think about that. Take your time. The immediate threat to your license is resolved." She hung up. The threat to her license was resolved. The word resolved felt strange applied to something that had felt ago like the specific mechanism by which the rest of her professional life would be dismantled. Her phone rang again. "Unknown number," she answered. "This is Gordon Price's attorney." The voice was clipped and male and had the quality of someone making a calculation while they spoke. "My client is prepared to provide full cooperation with the federal investigation in exchange for consideration on the charges. As part of that cooperation, he's prepared to make a formal statement affirming that the employment action taken against you on November 14th was directed by Dr. Doyle and processed through HR under explicit instruction to cite clinical grounds that my client acknowledges were not supported by the documented record." Sloane stood up. She walked to the window. "Why are you calling me?" she said. "Courtesy." And because my client's cooperation includes a specific account of a conversation between himself and doctor. Doyle on the morning of November 14th, prior to the employment action, in which Doyle explicitly stated that your documentation represented a, and I'm quoting my client's recollection here, liability that needed to be removed before the end of business. She looked at the street below. A woman was walking a small dog with a red coat on. The dog stopped to investigate something on the sidewalk with the focused intensity of a dog who had found something extremely important. Before the end of business, she said. Yes, he knew before Derek Holt died, she said. He knew before the rapid response. He was already planning the termination. My client's recollection is that the conversation occurred at approximately 9:45 a.m. You called the rapid response at 8:09, which meant Doyle had decided to fire her an hour before the surgery was finished. An hour before he could have known the outcome. He hadn't fired her because a patient died on his table. He had fired her because she had created documentation he couldn't control, and Derek Holt's death had simply been the justification he used in the public version. Your client should make that statement to Agent Okafor, Sloane said. Not to me, of course. I'm contacting her office as well. I wanted you to hear it directly. A pause. For what it's worth, Nurse Whitfield, my client is aware that his actions caused you significant harm. She hung up. She stood at the window for a moment with the phone in her hand. The dog with the red coat had finished investigating the sidewalk and moved on, its owner walking 2 steps behind, patient and unbothered. Okafor called at 6:30. Doyle was arraigned at 5, she said. 14 counts. Federal fraud, criminal negligence connected to 4 deaths, falsification of medical records, conspiracy. The U.S. Attorney's Office is pursuing additional counts as the supply chain documentation is processed. She paused. Price waived arraignment and entered a cooperation agreement. His attorney contacted us at 4:45. I know. He called me first. I heard. A beat. He shouldn't have done that. No. What he said about the 9:45 conversation, is that usable? Reports what we already have from the audit trail. Doyle attempted to modify Derek Holt's chart at 9:52 a.m. The record's hold was not confirmed until 11:07, which means he had a 15-minute window. Sloane's attention sharpened. Did he get the modification through? Partially. He amended 2 fields before the hold locked the record. But the audit trail captures every keystroke, what he changed, and what it read before he changed it. Okafor's voice was precise and careful. The original entry shows Doyle received the page about Holt's condition at 7:22 a.m. His amendment changed that to 8:07 a.m., 2 minutes before the rapid response was called. He tried to erase 45 minutes, Sloane said. He tried. The audit trail shows the original. Your notebook shows the original. Your recording from the corridor shows the original. She stopped. He amended the record, and the amendment itself became evidence of consciousness of guilt. Sloane thought about that. A physician with 6 years of institutional authority, access to the record system, an attorney on standby, and a plan he'd used before, and he had still done it wrong. Not because he was stupid, but because he had spent 6 years in a position where doing it wrong had no consequences. And that had made him imprecise. What about Meridian, she said. Federal agents executed warrants at their corporate offices in Richmond, Wilmington, and Baltimore this morning. We have their financial records, their communications, and their client database. Okafor paused. There are 31 names on Cook's Drive. 28 of them are now under active federal investigation. The remaining 32 are already in custody, and 1 is cooperating. 28, across 6 facilities, across 4 states. And the families, Sloane said, the patients who died. The U.S. Attorney is establishing a formal notification process. Each family will be individually notified and provided with the actual medical record, the unaltered version, as reconstructed from the audit trail, and will be given access to independent legal counsel to assess their options. Okafor paused. Derek Holt's family was notified this afternoon. Sloane sat down on the edge of the couch. The room was dim. She hadn't turned on lights as the afternoon went to evening. Just let it get dark around her. "How did they take it?" she said. "I wasn't in the room." The agent who was said, his mother, asked if the nurse who was with him knew what was happening. She had tried to help him. Sloane didn't say anything. The agent told her, yes, Okafor said quietly, that the nurse had documented everything and had spent every minute fighting for him. She paused. His mother asked for your name. Outside, the street was doing its evening things. Lights coming on in windows across the way, the ordinary architecture of other people's lives, going forward in the way that lives went forward, while extraordinary things happened inside the specific rooms that contain them. She can have it, Sloane said. 3 days later, the nursing board received a formal withdrawal of the complaint, submitted by Warren Tully's firm with a cover letter that attributed the withdrawal to changed circumstances without specifying what those circumstances were. The board acknowledged receipt and closed the matter without a formal review ever opening. On the same day, Sloane received a call from the interim CEO of Crestfall Regional, a woman named Dr. Patricia Selma, who had been brought in by the board to manage the hospital through the investigation period. She introduced herself briefly and then said what she'd called to say. The board has voted to formally rescind the employment action taken against you on November 14th, Selma said. Termination is removed from your record. You are entitled to back pay for the days since your termination. And on behalf of the hospital, I want to offer a direct and unqualified apology for what happened to you and to the patients under Dr. Doyle's care. Sloane was quiet for a moment. I appreciate that, she said. I want to ask you something. Of course. The other nurses. The ones Doyle cited in incident reports over the past 14 months. If the supply chain documentation shows what the federal investigation indicates it shows, some of those incident reports were generated to suppress accurate clinical documentation. She paused. I'd like the hospital to review every employment action involving nursing staff that runs through Doyle's cases and price HR decisions. Not just mine. A pause on Selma's end. That review has already been initiated, she said. As of yesterday. Another pause. It was actually recommended to us by Agent Okafor's office. She stopped again. Then, it was also recommended in writing by General Cook. Sloane thought about Cook, sitting up in his hospital bed with the drive in the bedside drawer, telling her about 11 years ago like it was something he'd been carrying at the same weight the whole time. Good, she said. Will you come back? Selma asked. To Crestfall. I recognize that's a complicated question. Sloane looked around her apartment. The 41 pages still on the table. The notebooks, the cold coffee, the grocery store bread. I don't know yet, she said honestly. I'll let you know. She hung up. She sat in the quiet of her apartment for a long time, not doing anything in particular. Not writing, not watching anything, not checking her phone. Just sitting with the specific and unfamiliar quality of a situation that had resolved mostly, largely, in its major structural components, and the way that resolution felt different from what she had imagined It would feel like when she'd been standing in the ambulance bay 2 days ago with her hands shaking and nothing in her future but a parking lot. Didn't feel like winning. It felt more like the end of something long, the particular exhale that comes after a sustained effort. Not triumphant, just real. She thought about Paula Reinholt in Annapolis. She picked up her phone and found the number Voss had given her 3 days ago. She hadn't called it yet. She called it now. It rang 4 times. Then a woman's voice, careful and slightly braced, the voice of someone who had been answering unknown numbers for 18 months and had learned to brace for what they contained. Reinhold, the woman said. My name is Sloane Whitfield, she said. Think you and I should talk. A pause. Then, quietly, I've been hoping someone would call. Sloane leaned back in her chair. Outside, a car passed. Somewhere in the building, a door closed. The ordinary world, moving through its ordinary evening, entirely indifferent to the fact that, in an apartment on the third floor, a nurse who had been fired, accused, and dismantled by the same machine that had dismantled this woman on the other end of the line, was finally, for the first time in 2 days, unclenching her hands. Tell me what happened to you, Sloane said. From the beginning. Reinhold took a breath, and then she heard it, something she hadn't expected in that voice, something underneath the carefulness and the 18 months of institutional attrition, a recording. Reinhold was silent for a moment, and then she said, very quietly, I have to tell you something first. Something I didn't tell the investigators when they came to see me last month. Sloane went still. I didn't tell them, Reinhold said, because I wasn't sure who they were working for. But I've been watching the news today, and I think maybe I was right about something I found 8 months ago. Something I found in my own personnel file, after they gave me a copy in the licensing review process. Her voice had steadied now, the braced quality replaced by something more deliberate. There's a name in my file, a name that doesn't belong there. Someone who accessed my record, who had no reason to know HR role, no clinical relationship to my case, no jurisdiction at St. Edmunds. Sloane waited. The name in my file, Reinhold said, is not Doyle. It's not Price. It's not Bryson. She paused. I looked it up when I found it. He's a physician. He has no connection to St. Edmunds and no connection to Crestfall Regional. She stopped. He does have a connection to Meridian Health Partners. He's on their medical advisory board. Has been for 6 years. Sloane said nothing. His name is Dr. Victor Ansel, Reinhold said. And this morning, I saw his name in the news. He gave a statement to a reporter defending Doyle. He said the federal investigation was politically motivated and that Marcus Doyle was being scapegoated for institutional failures. She paused one final time, and when she spoke again, her voice was entirely steady. Victor Ansel is the chief of trauma surgery at Garrison Medical Center in Washington, D.C. He's also the current chair of the Virginia Board of Nursing's Physician Advisory Panel. The silence on the line lasted 4 seconds. He's the one who decides, Sloane said, whether nursing board complaints move forward. Yes, Reinhold said. And his access to my personnel file is dated 3 days before my licensing review was approved for formal proceeding. She breathed. I think there are more of us, Whitfield. I think there are more than 31 names. And I think whoever built this knew exactly how to make sure that the people most likely to document accurately were the people least likely to be believed when they did. Sloane sat very still in her dim apartment, and she thought about a network that had spent years learning how to identify precise documentation, access the files of the people producing it, and route them into a professional destruction process overseen by the very board that was supposed to protect them. She thought about Victor Ansel's statement to the press this morning, the speed of it, the positioning, a man publicly defending Doyle while federal warrants were still being executed. Not because he was loyal, because he was exposed and moving first. I'm going to give your number to Agent Okafor, Sloane said. Tonight. And I want you to send me everything you have on Ansel. Every document, every date, everything from your personnel file. I've had it ready for 8 months, Reinhold said. I just didn't know who to send it to. Sloane stayed on the phone with Paula Reinhold for 47 minutes. She didn't record it, she didn't need to, because Reinhold had already done what Sloane had done, what apparently every nurse in this situation had eventually done when the institutional walls closed in, and the only protection left was the one you built yourself. She had documented everything. Its names, access logs, the specific sequence of events between her formal clinical concern and the licensing review initiation. 8 months of preserved evidence, organized and ready, because Reinhold had understood from the beginning that the fight was going to be long and that the only way through a long fight was to never stop carrying what was true. When they hung up, Sloane called Okafor. She gave her Reinhold's number, and she gave her Victor Ansel's name. And she gave her the specific detail about the personnel file access date, 3 days before the licensing review proceeded. And she listened to the quality of Okafor's silence on the other end, which was the silence of someone adding a piece to a structure they had thought was nearly complete and finding that it was larger than they'd mapped. "How long has Ansel been on the nursing board advisory panel?" Okafor asked. Reinhold said 6 years. Another silence. "That's the same duration as Doyle's tenure at Crestfall. The same duration as the Meridian consulting contracts." She stopped. If Ansel was positioned on the board's advisory panel at the same time Meridian was building the network, if his role there was structural from the beginning, then the complaint process wasn't a reactive tool, Sloane said. It was built into the architecture. They always had a mechanism to kill the documentation at the licensing level if record alteration and termination weren't enough. She heard Okafor writing, the scratch of it through the phone, fast and dense. "I need to brief the U.S. attorney tonight," Okafor said. "This changes the scope of the charging documents. Reinhold has everything organized. She'll cooperate fully." "I know she will." Okafor paused. "Get some sleep, Whitfield. You've done enough for tonight." Sloane looked at the dark window of her apartment. The street outside was quiet now, the ordinary evening having moved into the ordinary late night that preceded ordinary morning. "Okafor," she said. "Yeah, the families. Holt's family. The others. When the full scope of this comes out publicly, Ansel, the board panel, all of it, they're going to understand that the system built to protect patients was being used to protect the people harming them." She stopped. "Make sure the public accounting is complete. Not just the charges, the whole architecture, how it worked, who built it, so that it can't be quietly rebuilt somewhere else with different names." A pause. "That's not typically how federal investigations communicate their findings," Okafor said. "I know," Sloane said. "I'm not asking for typical." Another pause, longer. "I'll talk to the U.S. attorney about the public disclosure framework." It was as much as she was going to get tonight, and it was enough. Victor Ansel was arrested 11 days later. He was not arrested at Garrison Medical Center. He was arrested at a federal courthouse in Washington, D.C., where he had arrived voluntarily accompanied by 2 attorneys for what his legal team had apparently framed as a cooperative interview. The federal agents were waiting in the lobby. The charging document listed 7 counts, including conspiracy, obstruction of a federal investigation, and abuse of a regulatory position for personal gain. His attorneys immediately issued a statement calling the charges politically motivated, which was the same language Ansel had used in his press statement defending Doyle, and which, given the circumstances, had aged very badly in 11 days. Press picked it up within 2 hours. By afternoon, 3 other members of the Meridian Advisory Network had been identified in the charging documents as unindicted co-conspirators, which was the federal system's way of saying that their cooperation was being purchased and their full exposure was being managed. The Virginia Board of Nursing issued a statement announcing an emergency audit of all licensing actions involving the advisory panel for the past 7 years. 7 years, not 6. The additional year suggested they had found something that predated Ansel's formal placement on the panel, which was a detail the news coverage mostly missed, and which Sloane noted with the attention of someone who had learned that the details everyone missed were usually the ones that mattered. She watched the coverage at her kitchen table, with coffee that was actually warm, which felt like a small, luxurious thing. She had slept properly, for the first time in 2 weeks the night before, 8 hours, uninterrupted, in the specific way that the body reclaims sleep when the sustained emergency has finally released it from the requirement to stay ready. Her phone had been ringing with some regularity since the arrests began. Porter's, mostly which she didn't answer. Her attorney, which she did. Okafor twice, with updates that were factual and brief. And once, unexpectedly, Harriet, the charge nurse from Crestfall's ER, who called from her personal number and said, "Only, I should have fought harder for you that morning. I've been thinking about that every day." Sloane had said, "You did what you could in the system you were in." That's what we all did. It wasn't absolution, exactly, but it was true. And Harriet had exhaled on the other end of the line in a way that suggested it was what she needed to hear. Call she was waiting for came on the 14th day. It was Dr. Patricia Selma, the interim CEO of Crestfall Regional. "The board met this morning," Selma said. "I want to walk you through what was decided, and then I want to make you an offer." Sloane listened. The board had voted to establish a formal patient advocacy and clinical documentation review division at Crestfall, a department that would report directly to the CEO rather than to any clinical chief, with independent authority to review cases where nursing clinical concerns had been overridden by attending physicians. It would have subpoena access to the hospital's internal records, formal escalation pathways that bypassed departmental hierarchies, and a mandate to conduct quarterly audits of clinical outcome data against nursing documentation. "We're calling it the Clinical Integrity Division," Selma said. "It doesn't exist anywhere else in this hospital system. We're building it from scratch." "Who's running it?" Sloane said. "That's the offer," Selma said. "We want you to build it. Director of Clinical Integrity. You'd have full authority over hiring, protocols, and audit scope. You'd report to me directly and to the board on a quarterly basis." A pause. "Your documentation, your Army background, the way you operated under pressure during the Cook case. That's exactly the kind of judgment this division needs at its head." Sloane looked at the table in front of her. The notebooks. The 41 pages. The accumulated residue of 2 weeks of fighting something that had been built specifically to be unfightable. "I have a condition," she said. "Tell me." Paula Reinhold. "She's been fighting a licensing review for 18 months. If the board's emergency audit of the licensing actions proceeds correctly, her case should be among the first cleared. I want her offered a senior position in the division. Her documentation protocols, her experience surviving what she survived, that's institutional knowledge that doesn't exist in a textbook." Pause on Selma's end. "Then I'll make that call today." "And the other nurses," Sloane said. "The ones in the other facilities connected to the Meridian network. Not all of them will have somewhere to land when the investigations close. I want the division to have an explicit mandate to advocate for nursing staff at other institutions who are subject to retaliatory complaint processes. Not just at Crestfall. That's a broader mandate than the board approved this morning." Then go back to the board. Another pause. Longer this time. Kind that meant someone on the other end of the line was recalibrating what kind of conversation they'd thought they were having. "I'll go back to the board," Selma said. "Give me a week." "You have a week," Sloane said. "And Dr. Selma, the division needs to be publicly announced. Not as an internal administrative change, as a formal public commitment with specific language about what happened here and why this structure is being created." She paused. "Families deserve to see the institution acknowledge what was built inside it. Not in legal language, in plain language." Selma was quiet for a moment. "That's going to be a difficult conversation with our legal team," she said. "I imagine it will be, but it's the right one to have." She stopped. "I'll call you in a week." The sentencing hearings began 6 weeks later and ran across 2 months. Marcus Doyle was convicted on 11 of 14. Counts the 3 that didn't stick were the ones that required establishing specific intent in individual patient deaths, where the legal standard was high and the direct evidentiary chain had gaps that Doyle's defense had spent considerable resources creating. The 11 that did stick included fraud, criminal falsification of medical records, conspiracy, and criminal negligence in connection with 4 deaths that the prosecution's medical experts established, with clinical precision, had been preventable. He was sentenced to 19 years. He didn't speak at sentencing. His attorney spoke instead, which was the professional choice, and also, Sloane thought, probably the accurate one. There was nothing Marcus Doyle could have said in that room that would have helped him, and he was smart enough to know it. Gordon Price received 7 years under his cooperation agreement, reduced from a potential 22. He testified for 14 hours across 3 days at the federal trial, and his testimony, the 945A. Conversation, the HR routing system, the explicit instruction to use clinical grounds for terminations that had nothing to do with clinical performance was the connective tissue that tied the operational pattern together in a way the jury could follow. Colonel Dale Bryson received 12 years. His trial was separate, managed by the military justice system in parallel with the federal proceedings, and the charges reflected the specific gravity of a commissioned officer, using his position to obstruct an accountability investigation and provide advance intelligence to a criminal network. At his sentencing, the military judge said 3 sentences that the press covered extensively, and Sloane read once, carefully, and did not read again. That the betrayal of a review process designed to protect military patients was not merely criminal, but represented a particular kind of corruption of the mechanism built to prevent corruption, and that the sentence reflected the court's view that such acts required commensurate consequences. Victor Ansel pleaded guilty to 4 counts in exchange for cooperation that helped identify 2 additional members of the Meridian Network who had not appeared on Cook's original drive. He received 9 years. The Virginia Board of Nursing's emergency audit identified 33 licensing actions over 7 years that showed evidence of improper advisory influence. 29 were cleared. 11 nurses who had been stripped of or suspended from their licenses had them fully restored with formal written apologies from the board, a document that, to Sloane's knowledge, the board had never issued before in its history. Paula Reinholdt's license was among the first restored. Called Sloane the morning it happened. She didn't say much. Done, and Sloane said, "I know," and then they were both quiet for a moment on the phone, in the way that people are quiet when something has been true for a long time and is now also officially true. And the gap between those 2 states of truth turns out to have weight. The public announcement of Crestfall Regional Clinical Integrity Division happened on a Tuesday morning in February in the hospital's main conference room with the board chair and doctor. Selma at the front, and several rows of press and a group of nursing staff who had been invited specifically, and who Sloane noticed standing at the side of the room, were the ones who had been on the floor the morning Doyle pointed at her across the ER. Harriet was there. Tomas was there, out of his residency scrubs and in a clean shirt, looking slept properly for the first time in months. Petra was there, still with the particular tiredness of a person with 3 kids and a 40-minute commute, but also with something else in her expression that Sloane couldn't quite name and didn't try to. Selma spoke for 12 minutes. She said what she'd promised to say in plain language, not legal language, describing what had existed inside this hospital and for how long and what it had cost. She said their sectet. She said the names of the patients whose deaths were connected to the investigation. She said Derek Holt's name. She said it clearly. The way a name should be said when you're saying it on behalf of a person who can no longer be in the room. Then she introduced Sloane. Sloane had not prepared remarks. She had considered it and decided against it, because prepared remarks had a way of replacing the thing you actually meant to say with the polished version, and the polished version was not what this room needed. Stood at the front of the room and looked at the people in it. "I've been a nurse for 8 years," she said. 4 of those years I spent in places where the closest backup was 40 minutes away, and the only thing between a patient and a bad outcome was the accuracy of your assessment and your willingness to act on it. She paused. Came back from that, and I worked in this hospital, and I watched a physician ignore clinical data, alter records, and use the institutional process to make sure that the people paying attention couldn't be heard. And I'm standing here today not because I did anything exceptional. I'm standing here because I wrote things down. She looked at the nursing staff along the side of the room. That's the thing they were most afraid of, she said. Not the observation, the documentation. A clinical concern that lives in your head is manageable. Clinical concern with a timestamp is not. She stopped. Write things down. Every time. With the time. That's the beginning of every accountability that has ever worked. She sat down. The room was quiet for a moment, and then it wasn't. 3 weeks after the announcement, she got a call she hadn't expected. It was from a woman named Donna Holt, Derek Holt's mother. She had a voice that sounded like it had been through something and come out, the other side still standing, which Sloane supposed was accurate. She said she had been given Sloane's contact information by the U.S. Attorney's Victim Services Office, and that she hoped it was all right to call. It's all right, Sloane said. I wanted to ask you something, Donna Holt said, and I need you to tell me the truth, even if you think the truth is going to be hard to hear. Okay. Did he know when he was with you? Did he know that someone was fighting for him? Sloane thought about 8:04 a.m. Derek Holt's eyes, dark brown and glassy with pain, opening and finding her there. The question underneath his question. The answer she had given him. He asked me if he was going to be okay, Sloane said. I told him I was watching him carefully, and that I wasn't going anywhere. She paused. I meant it. I was there with him from the first minute I saw him until they took him to surgery. I didn't leave his side for 3 hours and 51 minutes. The silence on the other end lasted a long time. Thank you, Donna Holt said. Came out rough and precise, the way important things come out when someone has been holding them for a long time and is finally putting them down. I'm sorry I couldn't do more, Sloane said. You did everything you could. Yes, Sloane said. I did. They talked for another 20 minutes, not about the investigation, not about the charges or the sentencing or the legal proceedings that were still grinding through their various stages. They talked about Derek, his unit, the tattoo on his forearm, and what it meant. The way he'd looked when he enlisted, younger than his age and trying not to show it. Vet, Donna Holt told her he had wanted to be a paramedic after he got out. That he had been good at reading situations, good at staying calm. He got that from somewhere, Sloane said. On the other end of the line, Donna Holt made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something that wasn't. When they hung up, Sloane sat in her office now, at the end of the 4th floor administrative corridor, 2 rooms down from where General Cook had told her about a drive in a bedside drawer, and she looked at the wall for a while. She had put one thing on the wall, not a diploma, not a commendation. A single index card, handwritten, taped at eye level, directly across from her desk. Said 6:51 a.m., rigid abdomen, HR 114. Write it down. The date underneath it was November 14th. General Cook was discharged from Crestfall Regional on a Thursday afternoon in December, 42 days after his surgery. He walked out under his own power, which his surgical team had apparently expressed some professional skepticism about as recently as the previous week, and which he had responded to with the particular stubbornness of a man accustomed to making decisions about his own physical limits and living with the results. Stopped at Sloane's office on his way out. He knocked, which she hadn't expected. She said, "Come in," and he did. And he stood in the doorway in civilian clothes with a jacket over his arm and looked at the room she'd made in the space the hospital had given her. "How's the division?" he said. 14 cases reviewed in the first 3 weeks, she said. 2 required immediate escalation. 3 resulted in formal corrective action against attending physicians. The board is not enjoying it. Good, he said. She looked at him. He had the particular look of someone who had been very close to not being there and was aware of it without being dramatic about it, which she recognized as the specific way that awareness of that kind tended to settle in people who had been through it before. "How's the iliac vessel?" she said. "According to Finch, it looks better than she expected." He paused. She also said your intraoperative monitoring was the reason she had clean data throughout the repair. Finch did the work. Finch will tell you differently. She didn't argue with that. He looked at the index card on the wall. "Read it." Looked at her. "November 14th, he said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. The corridor outside her office was doing its ordinary corridor things, the ambient sound of a building that had absorbed something extraordinary and kept moving. Because buildings did that, because the work inside them didn't stop for what the buildings had been through. "I owe you an apology," Cook said. She looked at him. "For what?" "The audit found your name 3 weeks before the convoy. I knew you were here. I knew what was happening to the documentation you were producing, and I knew what that documentation meant for the investigation." He held her gaze. "I should have reached out. I prioritized the integrity of the investigation over the safety of the people inside it, and that was the wrong calculation." She sat with that for a moment. It would have been easy to say it was fine, that she understood that he'd had reasons. All of those things were true. They were also beside the point. "It would have helped," she said, "to know I wasn't alone in that building." "I know," he said. "I'm sorry." She nodded once. It was enough. He shifted the jacket on his arm. "The review board is being reconstituted. Bryson's out, obviously. 3 other members are under investigation. I've been asked to recommend replacements." He paused. "I'd like to recommend you for a civilian advisory role. Non-military, external perspective, with a specific focus on nursing and frontline clinical staff representation in the accountability process." She looked at him. "That's a significant ask," she said. "It's a significant position." He looked at her steadily. "The review board has spent 14 months being used as a tool by the people it was supposed to oversee. It needs people who know what that looks like from the inside." She thought about 11 months at Crestfall, about 651A, and the specific quality of a building that could not hear what it didn't want to hear. About Paula Reinhold in Annapolis, writing her notebooks for 18 months in the dark, keeping the evidence ready for someone who might eventually know how to use it. About what it meant to be the person who documented accurately in a system designed to make accurate documentation dangerous. "I'll think about it," she said. "That's all I'm asking." He turned to go. "General." He stopped, turned back. She looked at him. There were things she could have said about Kandahar and the 24th and the particular geometry of 2 people finding each other in the same hospital 11 years after a desert and a convoy and 4 hours of artillery 2 kilometers out. There were things she could have said about what it meant that he'd kept a drive in his jacket pocket through an ambush because he hadn't known who else to trust with it, and that when he woke up, he had asked for her. She didn't say any of those things. "Don't get shot again," she said. Something moved in his expression, not quite a smile. "The shape of one. I'll add it to the list," he said. He left. She heard his footsteps in the corridor, unhurried and steady, the walk of a man who was going to be fine. She listened until they faded, and then the corridor went back to being a corridor. She turned to her desk. There was a case file open on it. A nurse at a hospital in Richmond, 34 years old, 6 years of ICU experience, who had filed 3 formal clinical concerns over a 2-month period that had been overridden each time, and who had received a notice of pending disciplinary review the previous week. The referral had come through the network. Okafor's office was building a quiet, informal thing, not yet institutional, just people who had been through something sharing information with people who were going through it now. Sloane pulled the file toward her. She picked up her pen. She began to read. The thing about doing the right thing inside a system that is built to punish you for doing it is that nobody tells you it is going to work. Nobody guarantees the outcome. You document because documentation is what accuracy looks like, made physical. You escalate because escalation is what responsibility looks like, made audible. You stay at the bedside because the person in the bed is the reason the room exists. You do those things not because you know they will save the patient, or save your career, or eventually bring down the network of people who decided that silence was more valuable than lives. You do them because not doing them is the other option, and you've looked at the other option clearly enough to know what it costs. Sloane Whitfield had been fired, publicly accused, professionally dismantled, and handed back her future in pieces over the course of 6 weeks. She had written 41 pages at a kitchen table at 3 a.m. She had walked away from an elevator and gone the other way. She had sat in a dim apartment and called a woman she'd never met and said, "Tell me what happened to you from the beginning," because that was where you started when the ending was still unclear. She was not a hero in the cinematic sense. She was too tired for that, too familiar with what the work actually felt like, too honest about the moments when she had been afraid and uncertain and had done the next thing anyway, not out of courage, but out of the inability to identify a better option. She was a nurse who wrote things down. She was a nurse who stayed, and in a fourth-floor office in a hospital that had tried to make her disappear, with a case file open on her desk and an index card on her wall and a phone that was going to ring with the next referral from the next person who had documented accurately in the wrong building. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. She turned to the first page of the file. She wrote the date and the time at the top. She started reading.